far above the blue and white curve of a peaceful world, on a station that belonged to no single nation but to all who had learned to travel between the stars. The interstellar Concorde held its meetings. The round chamber was built like the inside of a giant shell, with high curved walls of pale metal, and a soft light that came from no single source. Delegates from 100 worlds sat in rings around the center floor, each one wrapped in the colors and shapes of their own people. Some had scales that shimmered blue and green. Some had forearms folded neatly at their sides. Some were so large that their chairs had to be built into the floor itself. And in one small ring, near the edge of the room, sat the delegation from Earth. General Diego Reyes stood at the small podium meant for his people. He wore the dark blue coat of the United Earth Fleet, with only a few medals on his chest, medals that meant nothing to most of the beings in that room. He was not a young man anymore. His hair had gone gray at the sides, and there were deep lines around his eyes from years of worry. But he stood straight, the way a soldier learns to stand even when his legs feel weak underneath him. Across the chamber, in the ring reserved for the most powerful members of the Concorde, sat Overlord Threx of the Corveth Dominion. Threx was tall, even for his own kind, with gray skin like old stone, and eyes that were a flat, cold yellow. He did not stand to speak. He never needed to. His voice came out low and amused, like a man watching children play a game he had already won. "Tell us again," Threx said. "How many ships does Earth have in its great fleet?" A soft ripple of laughter moved through parts of the chamber. Reyes felt his jaw tighten, but he did not let his face show it. 43 warships, Reyes said, and every one of them crewed by people who would give their lives to protect their home. 43, Threx repeated, as if tasting the word. The Dominion alone has more ships in a single fleet than your entire world has ever built. And yet you stand here, in this chamber, as if you belong among us. He turned his cold yellow eyes toward the other delegates, inviting them to share the joke. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others laughed openly, a dry, rattling sound from throats that were not human. Earth is a young child who has wandered into a room full of grown men, and it believes itself an equal. Reyes did not answer right away. He let the laughter finish. He had learned, over the past 15 years since Earth first made contact with the wider galaxy, that answering too quickly only fed the mockery. He waited until the room was quiet again. "A child grows," he said simply, "and children remember who laughed at them." The room went still for a moment. Threx's mouth curled, not quite a smile. "Is that a threat, General?" "It is a fact," Reyes said, "nothing more." Threx studied him for a long moment, the way a predator studies something it has already decided is too small to be dangerous. Then he waved one gray hand, dismissing the exchange as if it were beneath him. "The Dominion has a proposal for Earth," he said, and now his voice carried to the whole chamber, meant for every delegate to hear. "Your world sits at the edge of Dominion space. Your resources are adequate. Your people are hard workers, when properly guided. We offer Earth a place within the Dominion, full protection, full membership. In exchange, Earth need only accept the guidance of the Dominion in matters of trade, defense, and governance." "You mean surrender," Reyes said quietly. "I mean survival," Threx said. "There is a difference, General, though I understand it may be hard for your people to see it from where you stand. You have 30 days to send your answer. I would advise your leaders to choose wisely. The galaxy is not a kind place for those who stand alone." He said something else after that, in his own language, to the delegate beside him, and they both laughed, the sound rolling across the chamber like something cold. Reyes stood at his podium a moment longer, looking at the ring of faces around him, some amused, some pitying, a few, a very few, watching him with something that might have been quiet respect. Then he gathered his notes and walked out of the chamber, his back straight, his steps even, giving them nothing more to laugh at. News of the council session reached Earth within the hour, carried through the relay stations that linked the small planet to the rest of the Concorde. Commentators on every network argued over what Threx's offer truly meant, and whether General Reyes had done enough, standing alone in that vast chamber, to defend a world that had never asked to be tested this way. Some praised his composure under the weight of open mockery. Others said composure was not enough anymore. that Earth needed more than dignity to survive what was coming next. In quiet living rooms and crowded transit stations across 6 continents, ordinary people watched the same short clip of Threx's laughter play again and again, until the sound of it became, for a little while, the most familiar thing in the world. Not every voice in the Concord chamber that day had laughed along with the Corvette delegation. A handful of smaller worlds, species who had themselves once stood in Earth's position, newly arrived among the stars and unsure of their footing, watched Reyes's quiet defiance with something closer to sympathy than scorn. None of them spoke up in his defense. In a galaxy where the Corvette Dominion held enormous influence over trade routes and resource rights, sympathy was a currency few could afford to spend openly. But more than one delegate, on the long journey home from that session, found themselves thinking of the small, stubborn planet at the edge of Dominion space, and wondering, privately, whether Earth's 43 ships might one day surprise them all. Reyes himself did not learn of this quiet sympathy until much later. As his shuttle carried him back toward the transport that would return him to Earth, he thought instead of the 30 days now sitting over his world like a blade, and of the promise he had made to himself years before, after the border skirmish that had cost Daniel Cross his life, that he would never again stand in front of an enemy and offer them nothing but the same 43 ships and a lot of courage. He did not yet know that an answer to that promise waited, undiscovered, in the dark past Mars. He only knew that he intended to find one, wherever it might be hiding. Far from that chamber, on the edge of Earth's home system, the United Earth Fleet cruiser Defiant moved in a slow, steady orbit around the mining colony of Kepler's Landing. It was not a large ship. Next to the vessels of the Corvette Dominion, it would have looked like a toy, but to the people who served on it, the Defiant was home. Captain Elena Cross stood on the bridge, watching the stars through the front window. She was 34 years old, with dark hair pulled back tight, and a scar along one eyebrow from a training accident years before. She had been a captain for 6 years now, and in that time, she had learned to read her crew the way other people read books, the tired slump of a shoulder, the too quick answer that meant someone was hiding worry. "Anything from the Concord meeting?" she asked, without turning around. Lieutenant Priya Nair, at the communications station, shook her head. "Nothing official yet, Captain, but there's chatter on the open channels. People are saying the Dominion gave some kind of ultimatum." Elena's stomach tightened, though her face stayed calm. Of course they did. At the pilot's station, a younger man glanced back over his shoulder. Marcus Cross was 24, with the same dark hair as his sister, though he wore it shorter, and the same steady eyes, though his still had a brightness in them that hers had lost somewhere along the way. He had been flying with the Defiant for 8 months now, ever since finishing his training, and every day he tried very hard not to let anyone see how much he wanted his sister's approval. "You think they'll actually attack?" Marcus asked. "The Dominion, I mean. Or is it just more talk?" "With the Dominion, it's never just talk," Elena said. "Threx doesn't waste words. If he made an offer, it's because he already has a plan for what happens if we refuse it." Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning back to his controls. "Dad used to say the Dominion only understands one language." Elena's chest tightened at the mention of their father, the way it always did, even 6 years later. Captain Daniel Cross had died defending a border outpost from a Dominion probing attack, back when Marcus was still a teenager and Elena was newly out of training herself. He had held the line long enough for the colonists to evacuate, and then his ship had not come back. The Dominion had called it a small skirmish, barely worth mentioning. To Elena and Marcus, it had been the day their whole world changed. "Dad was right about a lot of things," Elena said quietly. "I just wish he was still here to say them himself." Marcus gave her a small, sad smile, and for a moment neither of them said anything, letting the hum of the ship's engines fill the silence. It was Priya who broke it, sitting up straighter at her station. "Captain, I'm getting a distress signal. It's coming from Kepler's Landing." Elena crossed the bridge in 3 quick steps. "Put it through." The voice that came over the comm was ragged with static and fear. "This is Kepler's Landing Colony Control. Does anyone read? We have ships in orbit, unknown configuration. They're not answering hails. Repeat, we have..." The signal cut out in a burst of noise. "Dominion ships," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Get us there," Elena said. "Full burn." "Priya," Alert Fleet Command. Tell them the Dominion just answered their own ultimatum early. The Defiant turned hard, engines flaring bright against the dark, and dove toward the small colony that had, until a few minutes ago, been just another quiet mining outpost on the edge of human space. When the Defiant came out of its final approach, Kepler's landing was already burning. The colony had never been much to look at, a cluster of domes and mining rigs built into the side of a rocky moon, home to maybe 3,000 people who spent their days pulling rare metals out of the ground to send back to Earth. Now half of those domes were open to space, torn apart, their lights flickering and dying one by one, like candles in the wind. 2 Dominion ships hung in orbit above the wreckage, sleek black shapes that dwarfed the Defiant, the way a wolf dwarfs a rabbit. "Oh God," Priya whispered. "Status on those ships," Elena said, forcing her voice to stay level. 2 Dominion light cruisers," came the report from Tactical. "They're not firing anymore. Looks like they already finished." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Marcus, get us in close enough to scan for survivors. Priya, hail those ships. I want to know why they attacked an unarmed civilian colony." The hail went out, and after a long moment, a face appeared on the main screen. A Corvette officer, gray-skinned like Threx, with the same flat yellow eyes, though younger, his stone-colored face unmarked by age. "United Earth Fleet vessel," the officer said, sounding almost bored. "You are too late. This colony refused a lawful demand from the Corvette Dominion to surrender its resources. The demonstration is complete." "Demonstration," Elena repeated, and she heard her own voice shake, just slightly, with rage. "You slaughtered civilians." "We destroyed structures," the officer corrected her. "Casualties were acceptable, given the lesson that needed teaching. Perhaps now your Earth Fleet Command will understand that the Dominion's patience has a limit." He paused, and something like amusement crossed his stone face. "Tell your superiors, little ship, that Overlord Threx sends his regards, and tell them the offer he made in the Concord chamber still stands, for now." The screen went dark. A moment later, both Dominion cruisers turned and slid away into the dark, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the galaxy and nothing at all to fear from the small ship watching them go. "Captain," Priya said, her voice thick, "I'm picking up survivors, not many, maybe 200, in the domes that are still sealed." "Get every shuttle we have moving," Elena ordered. "Marcus, take point on the rescue op yourself. I want every person who's still breathing off that rock in the next hour." Marcus was already out of his chair, but he paused at the bridge door, looking back at his sister. There was something in his face, not fear, not exactly, but the look of someone who had just learned something he could not unlearn. "Elena," he said, using her name instead of her rank, the way he only did when it was just the two of them. "How do we fight something like that? They didn't even care. They didn't even slow down." Elena did not have a good answer for him. She thought of their father, of the story their mother used to tell them at night when they were small, back before the world had changed. A story about a great sleeping ship, hidden somewhere far from Earth, that would wake up when humanity needed it most. It had always been just a bedtime story, something to make 2 frightened children feel safe in the dark. She had stopped believing in it around the same time she stopped believing in anything that could not be proven, measured, or flown. But standing on the bridge of a small, outmatched ship, looking at the broken remains of a colony full of people who had done nothing but refuse to bow, she found herself wishing, for the first time in a long time, that the story had been true. "Go," she said to Marcus. "Save who you can. We'll figure out the rest after." The next hour was the kind that stayed with a person for the rest of their life. Elena watched from the bridge as her small shuttles ferried survivors up from the dying colony. Burned miners, children crying for parents who would not be coming, an old woman clutching a photograph and nothing else, because there had been no time to grab anything more. Marcus worked without stopping, pulling people from collapsed domes with his own hands until his uniform was black with soot, and his voice was hoarse from shouting instructions. In one of the last domes still holding air, Marcus found a woman named Talia Reyes in Kimalu, no relation to the general, curled around her 2 small sons in a maintenance closet where the air recyclers had somehow kept working, long after the dome around them lost pressure everywhere else. She would not let go of either boy long enough to be carried, so Marcus carried all three at once, one small body slung over each shoulder, and the mother's arm locked around his neck, moving through smoke and broken metal by the light of his own helmet lamp, because the dome's emergency lighting had failed an hour before. "You're safe now," he told her, again and again, the way he had told a dozen other frightened people in the last hour, though he was no longer entirely sure he believed it himself. "My husband," Talia said, her voice raw. "He was on shift at the mining rig when they started firing. I don't know if—" "We'll look," Marcus said, because it was the only thing he could offer her that was both honest and kind. And he did look, in the last minutes before the shuttle had to leave, though he found no sign of the man among the wreckage. He carried that unanswered question with him back to the Defiant, one more small, unhealed wound among hundreds that day, and though he would tell no one, not even Elena, exactly how many faces like Talia's he had failed to find good news for, he carried each of them anyway, the way people who do this kind of work always do, quietly, and for a very long time afterward. Later, aboard the Defiant, he sat with Talia and her sons for a few minutes between shuttle runs, not because there was time to spare, but because some moments matter more than schedules. He did not have news of her husband. He only had his presence, and the quiet promise, spoken without words, that whatever happened next, she would not have to face it entirely alone. By the time the last shuttle returned to the Defiant, the death toll from Kepler's landing stood at just under 400 people. 2,600 more had lived, crammed now into a ship built to comfortably hold perhaps 300 crew. Elena gave the order to set course for Earth. As the Defiant turned away from the wreckage of the colony, she stood at the window a moment longer, watching the broken domes recede into the dark, and made herself a quiet promise. She did not know yet how she would keep it. She only knew that she would. 3 days later, the Defiant reached Earth, and the survivors of Kepler's landing were met by a world already reeling. News of the attack had traveled faster than the ship itself, carried by the same open channels Priya had first heard the rumors on. By the time Elena guided her ship into dock above Earth, the story was everywhere, on every screen, in every home, in every language spoken on the planet below. The images were the ones Marcus and his rescue teams had recorded without meaning to. Burned domes, crying children, the old woman with her single photograph. Analysts on every news channel argued about what it meant, what Earth should do, whether this was the beginning of a war Earth could not hope to win. General Reyes met Elena personally when the Defiant docked, something he rarely did for a single cruiser returning from patrol. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier, the lines around his eyes carved a little deeper. "You did good work out there, Captain," he said, once the survivors had been moved to receiving stations, and the two of them had a moment alone in the docking bay. "Better than good. You saved 2,600 people the Dominion wanted dead as a warning." "It wasn't enough," Elena said. 400 people are still dead, sir, and Threx didn't even blink." "I know." Reyes rubbed a hand over his tired face. "I was in that chamber, Elena. I watched him make his offer while his ships were already moving toward Kepler's landing. He never intended to wait 30 days. He wanted to show the Concorde, and us, exactly what happens to worlds that hesitate. So what happens now? Do we surrender?" Reyes was quiet for a long moment. "There are people in the government who think we should. They look at the numbers, our 43 ships against a Dominion battle fleet that could be in the thousands, and they say resistance is just a slower way of dying. They might even be right by the numbers. But I've spent my whole life in this fleet, and I've never once believed that numbers tell the whole story." Reyes looked at her, and for a moment, something like the old fire was back in his eyes. "There's someone I want you to meet, Elena. Someone who's been trying to get my attention for 2 years, and who I think, given what just happened at Kepler's landing, deserves to finally be heard." That evening, in a quiet office in the Fleet Command building, Elena met Dr. Amara Osei for the first time. Dr. Osei was a small woman in her 60s, with gray locks pulled back from a face that seemed built for patience, the kind of face that had spent decades listening more than talking. She was a historian by training, one of the last people alive who had spent her career studying the Vanguard War, the war that had nearly ended humanity 80 years before, back when Earth first learned it was not alone in the universe. and that not everyone out there was friendly. I knew your father, Dr. Osei said, once introductions were finished and tea had gone cold in 3 untouched cups. Not well. But I met Daniel Cross once, years ago, at a memorial event. He asked me a question that day that I've never forgotten. He asked me if I thought the old stories were true. Elena's chest tightened. What stories? The ones about Aegis Prime, Dr. Osei said. Marcus, who had come straight from the medical bay still smelling of smoke and antiseptic, made a small sound, half laugh, half something else. The sleeping giant. Mom used to tell us that story when we were kids. A lot of parents did. After the Vanguard War, Dr. Osei said. It became a kind of comfort story, passed down from the generation who actually lived through the war, to their children and grandchildren. A great ship, built in secret during humanity's darkest hour, hidden away and waiting for the day Earth needed it most. Most historians, myself included, for most of my career, treated it as exactly that, a comfort story, a myth born from trauma, the same way old sailors once told stories of monsters in the deep to explain the ships that never came home. You said most of your career, Elena said carefully. Past tense. Dr. Osei was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on the table in front of her. 2 years ago, I was given access to a set of sealed archives from the last years of the Vanguard War, records that had been locked away under the highest classification for 80 years, opened only because the last surviving council member who could authorize their release finally passed and left instructions in her will. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: supply reports, casualty lists, the things wars are actually made of, underneath all the stories we tell about them. She paused. But there was also a shipbuilding record, incomplete, heavily redacted, even after 80 years, but real, General. Not a story. A record of construction, materials, labor hours, launch preparations, for a vessel with a designation I had never seen in any official history. Aegis Prime. The room was very quiet. You're saying it's real, Elena said. I'm saying I don't know, Dr. Osei said, and there was something raw in her voice now. Something that had clearly been sitting inside her, unspoken, for 2 long years. I'm saying that the woman who signed off on those construction records 80 years ago was Chief Engineer Adeze Osei. My grandmother. Your grandmother, Marcus repeated. So she knew. She was there. She'd know if it was real or not. She died 40 years ago, Dr. Osei said quietly. She never spoke about her work during the war. Not to my mother, not to me. I always assumed it was because the memories were too painful. Now I wonder if it was because she'd made a promise to keep something secret, and she kept that promise until the day she died. She reached into the worn satchel at her feet and drew out a thin data tablet, its casing scratched with age. This is everything I have: construction logs, a partial crew manifest, and one thing more, a location, coordinates, buried 3 layers deep in an old supply requisition form for a facility listed only as Site 12. Reyes leaned forward. Where? The asteroid belt, Dr. Osei said. Out past Mars, in a debris field that's been marked as an old mining ruin on every star chart for 80 years. Abandoned. Radiation levels too high to be worth surveying, according to the official record. But radiation levels can be faked, General, if someone wanted a place to look abandoned when it wasn't. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Outside the window, the lights of the Fleet Command building reflected off the dark water of the harbor, and somewhere far above, unseen, an entire galaxy was waiting to hear what Earth would decide. I want to be clear about something, Dr. Osei said, into the silence. I am not telling you this because I'm certain it will save us. I've spent 2 years telling myself it was too dangerous, too uncertain, too likely to be nothing but an old woman's dying secret, with no ship attached to it at all. I kept it quiet because I was afraid of what would happen if people built their hope around a myth, and the myth turned out to be empty. She looked up, and her eyes moved from Reyes to Elena to Marcus, each in turn. But 400 people just died on Kepler's landing, because we had nothing to answer the Dominion with, except 43 ships, and a lot of courage. I don't know if Aegis Prime is real. I don't know if it still works, if it ever worked. If there's anything left in that asteroid field but rusted metal and 80 years of dust. But I know that not looking is its own kind of answer, and I'm no longer willing to give that answer. Reyes sat back slowly in his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who has just decided to bet everything on something he cannot promise will work. If word of this got out, and it turned out to be nothing, he said, it could destroy what little morale we have left. If word of it got out, and the Dominion learned we were chasing old legends about superweapons, they'd have every excuse to strike first, hard, before we could ever get there. He looked at Elena. This has to be small, quiet, a handful of people, not a fleet. I'll go, Elena said, before she had even fully decided it. Elena, Marcus started. I'll go, she said again, more firmly. I commanded the ship that pulled 2,600 people off a dying colony 3 days ago, Marcus. I watched a Dominion officer call 400 deaths acceptable losses without so much as blinking. If there is even the smallest chance that something out there could change what happened at Kepler's Landing from ever happening again, I am not going to be the person who decided it wasn't worth checking. Then I'm coming too, Marcus said, and there was no argument in his voice this time, only certainty. Dr. Osei looked at the two of them for a long moment, this brother and sister who carried their father's steadiness in their shoulders even now, and something in her tired face softened. My grandmother built that ship not knowing if it would ever be needed, she said quietly. I would like to be there, if it is. Reyes studied the three of them, the historian who had kept a family secret for 2 years out of fear, and the two young officers who had just watched their world's weakness paraded in front of an alien empire, and answered it not with anger, but with resolve. All right, he said finally. I'll authorize a small team, quietly. You'll need an engineer, someone who can assess whatever you find out there, and tell us if it's worth anything at all. I know just the man. He paused, and something almost like a smile crossed his tired face. God help us all if this is nothing but an old woman's ghost story. And if it isn't? Elena asked. Then may God help the Corvette Dominion, Reyes said, because we certainly won't be inclined to. That night, as the story of Kepler's Landing spread across every screen on Earth, the Corvette Dominion released its own broadcast, carried on every channel the Concorde allowed it to reach. Overlord Threx appeared calm, almost gentle, as he addressed the people of Earth directly for the first time. People of Earth, he said, you have seen what happens to those who refuse the Dominion's generosity. We take no pleasure in it. But a fleet of 43 small ships cannot protect a world of billions, and your leaders know this, even if they will not say it to you plainly. The offer made to your General Reyes still stands. 30 days remain. I would ask you to consider, how many more Kepler's Landings are your leaders willing to risk, for the sake of a pride that cannot save you? The broadcast ended with a final shot of the two Dominion cruisers leaving the wreckage of the colony behind, unhurried, untroubled, exactly as they had appeared to Elena 3 days before. Across Earth, in homes and shelters and crowded city squares, billions of people watched that final image and felt, for the first time in their short history among the stars, the true weight of how small they truly were. But in a quiet room in the Fleet Command building, a small data tablet sat on a table between 4 people who had just decided to go looking for a legend. Later that night, Elena found Marcus on the observation deck of the Fleet Command Station, looking down at the curve of Earth below, blue and white, and so very small against the dark. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, coming to stand beside him. Kept seeing that old woman, Marcus said quietly. The one with the photograph. She didn't cry, you know. Not once. The whole time I was helping her onto the shuttle. She just held onto that picture like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. He shook his head. How do you fight people who can do that to someone and call it a demonstration? Elena did not have an easy answer, so she gave him an honest one instead. I don't know yet, but I know we're not going to find out by doing nothing. Marcus glanced sideways at her. Do you actually believe it? What Dr. Osei said? A giant ship, hidden out there for 80 years, just waiting? Elena thought about it seriously before she answered, because Marcus deserved a serious answer, not a comforting one. I believe Dr. Osei believes it, she said slowly. I believe her grandmother's name is really on those construction records. Whether that adds up to an actual working warship sitting in an asteroid field, Or just an old wartime project that got cancelled and buried in paperwork like 1,000 other things governments start and never finish? I don't know that yet. She paused. But I'll tell you what I do believe. I believe that 400 people are dead because Earth walked into that Concorde chamber with 43 ships and nothing else to show for 80 years of survival. And I believe that if there is even a chance we've been sitting on something more than that this whole time, too scared or too proud to go looking, then we owe it to every person on Kepler's landing to go find out. Marcus was quiet for a while, looking down at the Earth turning slowly beneath them. Somewhere down there, in a small house outside a city that no longer existed in quite the same shape it had 6 years ago, their mother had once tucked 2 children into bed and told them a story about a great sleeping ship that would wake up when the world needed it most. Neither of them had believed it, not really, not for a long time. Belief was a luxury that had gotten harder to afford with every year that passed, since their father did not come home. Dad would have gone looking, Marcus said finally. Wouldn't he? If he'd known what Dr. Osei knows. Dad would have already been halfway to the asteroid belt by now, Elena said, and there was the faintest ghost of a smile in her voice, without waiting for anyone's authorization. Marcus laughed, a small, surprised sound, the first real laugh either of them had managed in 3 days. That does sound like him, Elena thought. Not for the first time, that grief had a strange way of softening into something almost like company, if you carried it long enough beside the right person. She had spent 6 years missing her father in 100 different ways, in the silence after a hard landing, when she used to hear his voice offer feedback, in the particular ache of watching Marcus grow into exactly the kind of pilot their father would have been proud to fly beside. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, the missing felt less like a wound and more like a compass, pointing her toward the same direction their father would have chosen, had he lived to see this day. They stood together a while longer, 2 people who had lost a father to an enemy that did not seem to notice or care what it took from the world, watching the Earth turn beneath them, fragile and blue, and entirely unaware of how close it stood to either salvation or ruin. 30 days remained before the Dominion's ultimatum expired. Somewhere out past Mars, in a field of dead rock that every star chart called worthless, something that might have been nothing more than an old woman's comforting story, or might have been humanity's last and greatest secret, was waiting in the dark, exactly as it had waited for 80 long years. Elena did not know, standing there beside her brother in the quiet of the observation deck, whether they would find a miracle in that asteroid field, or nothing at all but rust and disappointment and 80 years of dust. She only knew that for the first time since the smoke had cleared over Kepler's landing, she felt something other than helpless. She felt like Earth, at long last, had a direction to look. And far away, in the cold spaces between the stars, on a command deck built for a conqueror who had never once doubted his own strength, Overlord Threx watched the recording of his own broadcast one final time, before retiring for the night, entirely satisfied with the fear he had planted in a small, foolish world that still had not learned the most important lesson the galaxy had to teach. He did not know, and would not have believed even if he had been told, that 80 years ago, in a war he had never heard of, against an enemy Earth no longer spoke of by name, humanity had already learned that lesson once before, at a cost so terrible that they had buried the proof of what they built to survive it, deep in the dark, and let the galaxy believe they were as small and as harmless as they appeared. He was laughing at ships he could see. He did not yet know to be afraid of the one he could not. 2 days after the meeting in Dr. Osei's borrowed office, a small group gathered in a windowless briefing room deep beneath the Fleet Command building, in a section of the base that did not appear on any public directory. General Reyes had kept his promise. Waiting for Elena and Marcus when they arrived was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with grease permanently worked into the lines of his hands, introduced simply as Chief Engineer Tobias Klein. Reyes tells me you 3 are about to go dig through 80-year-old rubble looking for a ghost story, Tobias said, by way of greeting, shaking Elena's hand with a grip like a vice. I told him I'd only come along if there was a real chance it wasn't a complete waste of my time. He said there was. I've known Reyes 22 years. He's wrong about plenty of things, but he doesn't send people chasing nothing. You worked with him before? Elena asked. Kept half his fleet running during the border skirmishes, Tobias said. including, if I remember right, your father's ship, before he stopped himself, and something apologetic crossed his broad face. Sorry, wasn't trying to bring that up. It's all right, Elena said, and found that she meant it. There was something steadying about a stranger who had known her father only as a name on a repair manifest, not as a martyr or a memory to be handled carefully. Reyes had spent 2 full days deciding on the composition of this team, turning over every name in Earth's fleet roster, before settling on the 4 people now gathered in this windowless room. He needed a pilot capable of the kind of quiet, careful flying that would keep the Meridian invisible to Dominion patrols, and Elena's record, 6 years without a single reported incident despite some of the most difficult postings in the fleet, made her the obvious choice, whatever his private reservations about sending a woman who had already lost her father to this enemy into a mission this uncertain. He needed an engineer whose discretion he trusted completely, and Tobias Klein, 22 years a quiet, reliable presence in every crisis Reyes had weathered, fit that requirement better than any younger officer, with a more impressive record, but a less proven temperament. And he needed, though he had not fully admitted this to himself until Dr. Ossie sat across from him, with her worn satchel and her 2 years of carried secrecy, someone who could translate an old woman's guilt into something the rest of them could actually use. I won't pretend this is a comfortable decision, Reyes told them, before the briefing properly began. I am sending 3 people I respect deeply, and 1 very talented young officer I have watched grow up in this fleet, chasing a legend with a 2% chance, by my own rough estimate, of being anything more than an expensive disappointment. If any of you want to walk away from this table right now, I will not think less of you for it, and no one outside this room will ever know you were asked. Nobody moved. Marcus, sitting very straight in his chair, was the first to break the silence. With respect, sir, I think you already know none of us are walking away. Reyes looked at each of them in turn, and something behind his tired eyes, some old weight he had carried since the day Daniel Cross's ship failed to return from its final patrol, seemed to ease, just slightly. No, he admitted. I suppose I did already know that. Dr. Ossie arrived a few minutes later, carrying the same worn satchel from before, along with a second bag that clinked faintly with old data drives and printed documents she had apparently decided not to trust to any network, however secure. I want to be honest with all of you before we go any further, she said, once the door was sealed and Reyes had joined them at the small briefing table. What I have is a location and a name. I do not have a working ship, a functioning crew, or any guarantee that Site 12 contains anything more than sealed emergency rations and 80 years of silence. Chief Klein, your job out there is not to hope. It's to look at whatever we find with clear eyes and tell us honestly whether it's real, whether it's usable, and whether it's worth the risk we're about to take to reach it. Fair enough, Tobias said. Though for what it's worth, Doc, I've spent 30 years fixing things other engineers swore were beyond saving. I try to keep an open mind. Reyes spread a star chart across the table, the asteroid belt marked in soft blue light, with a single point flagged in red near its outer edge. This is Site 12, he said. Officially, it's an abandoned mining claim, radiation levels too high to be worth surveying, since the year the claim was filed. Unofficially, according to Dr. Ossie's records, radiation readings from a facility can be falsified from a control station, provided someone with the right access wanted a place to look abandoned for 80 years running. How do we get there without the Dominion noticing? Marcus asked. Carefully, Reyes said. The Dominion doesn't have eyes on every rock in that belt, but they've increased patrols since the ultimatum, watching for exactly the kind of thing we're about to attempt, Earth trying to find some hidden advantage before the 30 days run out. You'll take the Meridian, a survey vessel registered to a civilian mining company that genuinely does operate in that sector. On paper, you're 4 scientists and a hired pilot doing routine mineral surveys. If a Dominion patrol stops you, that story needs to hold. And if it doesn't hold? Elena asked. Reyes's face did not change, but something in his eyes went very still. Then I would remind you that the entire future of this mission depends on nobody outside this room knowing what you're actually looking for. I am trusting each of you with something I have not even told the full Council of Nations, because if this fails, if it turns out to be nothing, or if the Dominion learns we went looking, The political cost could be worse than if we had never tried at all. I need you to understand exactly how much weight you're carrying onto that ship." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus, who had been quiet through most of the briefing, spoke up. 400 people are already dead at Kepler's Landing, sir. I think we understand weight just fine." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, and something that might have been pride flickered across his tired face. "All right," he said. "You leave at dawn." Outside the briefing room, as they gathered the last of their equipment, Dr. OCA fell into step beside Elena. "Your brother has good instincts," she said quietly. "Your father would be proud of both of you, for whatever that's worth, from an old historian who only met the man once." "It's worth a lot, actually," Elena said, and she meant that too. That night, before the small team departed, the Council of Nations met in emergency session, broadcast to the public in a carefully edited form that left out any mention of a secret mission departing at dawn. Elena watched the broadcast from her quarters, unable to sleep, as delegates argued over screens split into a dozen feeds, representatives from every major nation on Earth debating the same impossible question in a dozen different languages. Some argued for immediate acceptance of the Dominion's terms. Better a humbled Earth under Dominion rule, they said, than a dead Earth defiant to the end. Others argued that surrender now would only be the first of many demands, that the Dominion's history in the wider galaxy showed clearly what happened to worlds that gave up their independence piece by piece. The debate stretched past midnight, unresolved, exactly as Elena suspected it would stretch on for the full 30 days of the ultimatum, because there was no answer that did not risk everything Earth had left. She turned the broadcast off before it ended, and lay awake a long time, thinking of an asteroid field that had waited 80 years to be found, and hoping, more than she had let herself hope for anything in a very long time, that it would be worth the finding. At dawn, the Meridian slipped out of Earth's orbital traffic lanes, one small survey vessel among the hundreds that came and went every day, indistinguishable from any other ship chasing mineral claims into the deep dark of the asteroid belt. It took 4 days to reach the outer edge of the belt at the Meridian's careful, unremarkable civilian speed, a pace Elena found almost unbearable after a lifetime of fleet vessels built for urgency. She spent the first day pacing the ship's cramped corridors until Tobias, without looking up from the equipment he was recalibrating, told her that pacing wouldn't make the stars go by any faster, and she may as well make herself useful. "Fine," Elena said. "Put me to work. Do you know anything about power core diagnostics? I know how to fly a cruiser into a firefight. I don't know the first thing about your equipment." "Then sit down and let me teach you," Tobias said, "because if we find what the doc thinks we're going to find, every pair of trained hands is going to matter, and I'd rather you learn the basics now, bored out of your mind in deep space, than scrambling to catch up later with something ancient and half dead in front of us." So Elena learned. Over the following days, Tobias walked her and Marcus both through the fundamentals of power systems, old and new, his broad hands surprisingly gentle, as he demonstrated the careful, patient work of diagnosing a failing system without destroying whatever life remained in it. "My father was an engineer," Tobias told them one evening, as the three of them and Dr. Ose shared a meal in the Meridian's small galley. Not fleet, just civilian, kept the water recyclers running in a housing block outside what used to be Lagos before it got resettled after the Vanguard War. He used to say there were two kinds of engineers in this world, the ones who saw a broken machine and wanted to replace it, and the ones who saw a broken machine and wanted to understand why it broke in the first place. I've always tried to be the second kind. You learn a lot more that way, about machines, and about people too, if I'm honest. "And which kind was my grandmother?" Dr. Osi asked, with the ghost of a smile. "Never met the woman," Tobias said, "but from what little the doc's shown me of her old notes, I'd guess she was the rarest kind of all, an engineer who understood a machine so well, she was willing to bury it rather than risk it falling into the wrong hands. That takes a particular kind of person. Not many folks build something extraordinary and then have the discipline to hide it away and never speak of it again, whatever the cost to their own reputation." Dr. Ose was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "I used to be angry at her for it," she admitted. "Growing up, I didn't know what she'd hidden, of course. I only knew that my mother always described her as distant, unreachable, carrying some grief she never explained to anyone. I used to think it was cowardice. Now, she shook her head. Now I think it might have been the bravest thing anyone in my family ever did. To build something powerful enough to end a war, and then to spend the rest of her life making sure nobody ever had the chance to use it for anything less than absolutely necessary. Marcus, who had been listening quietly, glanced up. Do you think that's what we're doing now? Something absolutely necessary? I think, Dr. Ose said slowly, that 400 people are dead on a mining colony that never fired a single shot at anyone, and an alien overlord called it an acceptable lesson. If that isn't necessary, Lieutenant Cross, I don't know what my grandmother would have considered the bar to be. Priya, who had said little through the meal, finally spoke up from her seat near the galley door. I lost my sister at Kepler's Landing, she said quietly, and the words landed in the small room like something heavy set down after being carried too long. Not lost exactly. She wasn't a colonist there. She was a comms technician on contract, helping upgrade the colony's relay equipment. She was supposed to rotate back to Earth the week before the attack, but the transport got delayed. Some routine mechanical issue. Nothing anyone could have predicted. She looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about how close it was. One delayed transport. That's the only reason I'm sitting here and not identifying a body. Elena reached across the small table and rested a hand briefly on Priya's arm, not offering words, because she understood, better than most, that some grief did not want words yet. I didn't ask to come on this mission because I believe in old legends, Priya continued after a moment. I asked because I couldn't stand the thought of sitting on the Defiant, doing routine patrols while people who might actually be able to change something were out here without me. I needed to be doing something, even if the something turns out to be nothing. It won't turn out to be nothing, Dr. Ose said, with a quiet certainty that surprised even her. Whatever else we find out there, Lieutenant Nair, I promise you that much. Priya managed a small, tired smile, the first Elena had seen from her since they departed Earth. I'm going to hold you to that, Doctor. None of them spoke for a while after that, each lost in their own version of the same grief that had, in one way or another, brought them all to this small ship, hurtling through the dark toward a legend that might save everything, or might simply confirm what the numbers had already suggested, that Earth was too small and too late to matter to a galaxy that had already decided its answer. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the kind that grows between people who have decided, without quite saying so out loud, to trust each other with something enormous. Outside the small viewport of the galley, the stars slid slowly past, indifferent and constant, the same stars that had watched Adeze Ose build her secret ship 80 years before, the same stars that would watch whatever came next, whether it ended in miracle or in nothing at all. On the 5th day, the Meridian sensors picked up the first Dominion patrol ship, a dark shape sweeping a slow, methodical search pattern through the outer asteroid field, close enough that avoiding it would take every ounce of skill Marcus had learned in 8 months of service, and every hour Elena had spent, years before, learning to fly quiet. Everyone to stations, Elena said, feeling the old, familiar calm settle over her, the one that had nothing to do with fearlessness, and everything to do with having a job to do, and knowing exactly how to do it. Let's see if a survey ship full of scientists can keep a secret. The Dominion patrol ship was smaller than the cruisers that had attacked Kepler's Landing, built for speed and search rather than destruction, but it carried scanning equipment powerful enough to read the heat signature of a mouse from 1,000 kilometers away, and Elena knew it. Kill all non-essential power, she said quietly. Marcus, take us in behind that rock formation, slow, no sudden burns. Tobias, I need every system that isn't life support running as close to civilian baseline as you can manage. If they scan us, I want them to see exactly what our paperwork says we are. A tired survey crew, running old, boring equipment, nothing more. On it, Tobias said, already moving. Marcus eased the Meridian into the shadow of a massive, tumbling asteroid, cutting their forward thrust to almost nothing, letting the ship drift on old momentum alone. On the main screen, the Dominion patrol continued its slow sweep, close enough now that Elena could make out the ship's markings, a mid-sized scout vessel, the kind used for exactly this purpose, hunting for anything Earth might be trying to hide before the ultimatum ran its course. They're changing course. Priya's voice came through on comm from where she monitored sensors, having insisted on joining the mission herself once she learned Elena and Marcus were both going. Heading this way. I think they picked up our engine wake before we cut thrust. Everyone stay still, Elena said. Dr. Ose, if they hail us, you're the lead scientist on this survey. Can you handle that? Dr. Ose, to her credit, did not hesitate. I have spent 40 years lecturing board students about wartime supply logistics. I believe I can manage a board Dominion patrol officer. The Dominion ship drew closer, its running lights sweeping across the tumbling field of rock, and for a long, terrible minute, it seemed certain to pass directly over the shadow where the Meridian hid, close enough for even a basic scan to catch something a trained eye would recognize as more than 4 scientists and their equipment. Then, at the last possible moment, the comm crackled to life. Unregistered vessel, in restricted survey sector, identify yourself, came a flat, bored voice, Corvith accented, clearly reciting a script the speaker had recited 100 times before, on 100 other quiet patrols. Dr. Ose answered without a trace of the fear Elena knew she must be feeling. This is the survey vessel Meridian, registered to Halden Mining Consortium, filing number 47219. We're conducting routine mineral density scans in this sector, under our standing Concord trade permit. Apologies if we're in your patrol path, happy to relocate if you need the space. There was a pause, long enough that Elena's hand drifted, without her quite deciding to move it, toward the emergency thrust controls. Halden Mining, the voice repeated. Your permit is old. Why does a mining survey vessel show heat signatures consistent with recent hard maneuvering? Elena's blood went cold. Beside her, Tobias's hands moved fast and silent across a control panel, adjusting readings, and Dr. Ose, without missing a beat, answered, as though she'd expected the question all along. We had a minor thruster malfunction 2 days back. Nothing serious. Our engineer's been working on repairs the whole trip. If your scans are picking up irregular heat signatures, that's probably it. We've been running a diagnostic burn every few hours, trying to shake loose a valve that's stuck in the primary coupling. I can send you the maintenance log if it would put your mind at ease. It's terribly boring reading, I promise you. Another pause. Then, to Elena's enormous relief, something that might have been a bored sigh crackled through the comm. Not necessary. Do not deviate from your filed survey coordinates. Dominion patrols are increased in this sector until further notice. Any unregistered maneuvering will be treated as hostile. Understood. And thank you for your patience, Dr. Ose said, and the Dominion patrol ship, without further comment, resumed its slow sweep and moved on into the dark, its running lights shrinking gradually to nothing among the tumbling rocks. For a long moment, nobody on the Meridian moved. Then Marcus let out a long breath that seemed to have been building in his chest since the hail first came through. Remind me, he said, never to play cards against you, Dr. Ose. I taught history for 40 years, Dr. Ose said, and Elena could hear, underneath the dry humor, just how badly her hands were shaking as she folded them in her lap. You learn to think quickly when 300 bored undergraduates are waiting for you to say something interesting. Nice work, everyone, Elena said, and meant it, though her own pulse was only now beginning to slow. Let's get moving again, before their patrol pattern brings them back this way. They did not encounter another patrol for the remaining 2 days of the journey, though Elena kept the ship's sensors running at full alert the whole way, sleeping in short, uneasy shifts, waking at every small sound the old survey vessel made settling around them. By the time the Meridian's navigation system chimed softly to announce their arrival at the coordinates Dr. Ose had carried, buried for 2 years in a data tablet at the bottom of a worn satchel, all 4 of them were exhausted in the particular way that came from days of controlled fear. There, Priya said quietly, pointing to the main screen. That's Site 12. For a moment, nobody moved, all 4 of them simply staring at the small, unremarkable shape on the display, so ordinary-looking that it was almost impossible to believe 2 years of careful secrecy and 80 years of buried history had led, at last, to this exact point in space. Elena found herself holding her breath without quite meaning to, the way a person holds their breath before opening a letter that might contain either the best or the worst news of their life. On the main screen, Site 12 looked exactly as advertised on every star chart for 80 years. A dead, tumbling asteroid roughly the size of a small mountain, its surface scarred with the abandoned scaffolding of a mining operation long since stripped for parts, its silhouette dark against the deeper dark of space. Radiation readings match the old survey data, Tobias reported, scanning his instruments. High enough to explain why nobody's bothered coming back here in 80 years. If it's fake, whoever set it up did a very thorough job. My grandmother was very thorough, Dr. Osei said quietly. Marcus guided the Meridian into a slow orbit around the asteroid, running passive scans across its cratered surface, searching for anything that might hint at more than abandoned mining equipment. For nearly an hour, they found nothing, just rock and rust, and the broken bones of machinery that had, by every visible sign, been dead for 8 decades. Then, on the asteroid's far side, shadowed from Earth's distant sun, Priya's instruments picked up something the others had missed. "Wait," she said, "I'm reading a structural anomaly. There's a section of the surface here that reads as solid rock on visual scan, but the density readings don't match. It's hollow behind it. Or, not hollow, reinforced. Like there's something built into the rock itself, shielded to look like more of the same debris." "Can you get us a visual?" Elena asked. Priya adjusted the ship's sensors, and after a moment, an image resolved on the main screen, a section of the asteroid's surface that looked, to the naked eye, identical to every other crater-pocked stretch of rock around it, except for a series of faint, almost invisible lines cut into the stone in a pattern too regular to be natural. "That's a door," Tobias said softly. "Or used to be one." They brought the Meridian in as close as they dared, and Marcus, with the careful precision of a pilot who had spent the last 5 days learning just how much weight rode on every maneuver he made, guided the ship to a gentle landing on a flat shelf of rock, a short distance from the hidden structure. Suiting up took 20 minutes, each of them checking and rechecking seals in the particular silence of people about to walk into an unknown that might, after everything, turn out to be nothing more than an empty room and 80 years of disappointed hope. "If it's real," Dr. Osei said, as she sealed her helmet, her voice carrying a tremor she made no effort to hide, now that they were finally, actually here, then somewhere behind that door is the last thing my grandmother ever built, and the last secret she ever kept. I've waited 2 years to find out if I have the courage to actually open it." "You've already found that courage, Doc," Tobias said gently. "You're standing here, aren't you?" Marcus, checking his own suit seals one final time, found himself thinking not of his father, as he might have expected, but of the countless bedtime nights his mother had spent weaving this exact story for 2 frightened children who no longer entirely believed the world was safe. He wondered, standing on the edge of that dark, silent asteroid, whether she had ever suspected, telling that story, how close to true it actually was, or whether she had simply needed, as much as her children did, something to believe in during the hardest years either of them would ever live through. Either way, he thought, she deserved to know, someday, exactly how right she had been. The 4 of them, Elena, Marcus, Dr. Osei, and Tobias, with Priya remaining aboard the Meridian to monitor sensors and watch for any sign of Dominion patrols, made their way across the asteroid's broken surface, in the strange, bounding steps of low gravity, headlamps cutting narrow cones of light through absolute darkness. Up close, the hidden door was unmistakable, once you knew to look for it, a seam in the rock too straight, too deliberate, framed by machinery that had clearly once moved under its own power, and now sat frozen, fused by 8 decades of vacuum and cold. Tobias ran his gloved hands over an old control panel set into the stone beside it, its surface pitted and dark. "No power," he reported. "Whatever kept this thing locked and hidden for 80 years has been dead a long time, which is either very bad news or it means whatever's behind this door has its own power source," Elena finished, "and this door was never meant to run on it." "There should be a manual override," Dr. Osei said, consulting the old data tablet with hands that shook only slightly now. "My grandmother's notes mention an emergency access protocol, physical, not electronic, built for exactly this scenario, in case the facility's own systems ever failed." It took the better part of an hour, working by headlamp in absolute silence broken only by their own breathing, before Tobias finally located the manual release Dr. Osei's notes described, a heavy lever hidden behind a section of false rock, stiff with 80 years of disuse. On my count, Tobias said, this is either going to open onto the greatest engineering achievement in human history, or it's going to open onto an empty storage room, and I'm going to feel very foolish about the last 2 weeks of my life. On your count, Elena agreed. Tobias counted down, and together, all 4 of them threw their weight against the ancient lever. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of metal that had not moved in 80 years, the ancient door shuddered and began, with agonizing slowness, to slide open. Stale, recycled air hissed past them into the vacuum, the first breath the facility had drawn in 8 decades. Beyond the door lay a short access tunnel, its walls lined with old emergency lighting strips, dark and dead. Tobias's headlamp found a secondary panel just inside the entrance, and after a moment of careful work, he managed to coax a single strip of emergency lighting back to a dim, flickering half-life. Someone built this to last, he murmured, running a hand along the tunnel wall. 80 years, no maintenance, and the basic structure's still sound. That's not luck, that's design. They moved deeper into the tunnel, following it downward at a gentle grade, the artificial gravity growing subtly stronger the further they went, until Elena realized with a small shock that they had left the asteroid's natural low gravity behind entirely, replaced by something that felt almost like Earth-normal weight, generated by systems that had somehow, impossibly, kept running through 8 decades of silence and abandonment. That takes power, Marcus said quietly, echoing her own thought. A lot of it, if the gravity systems are still active. He did not need to finish the sentence. They all felt it, the same fragile, impossible hope, growing with every step deeper into the dark. The tunnel opened, finally, into a vast antechamber, and here, Tobias's careful work with the old emergency systems paid off, because as they stepped through, a series of long dormant lights flickered, hesitated, and then, one by one down the length of the enormous room, came slowly, steadily to life. What the light revealed took every one of their breaths away. The antechamber was a museum of memory, exactly as Dr. Osei's grandmother had left it 80 years before. Rows of old workstations, computer terminals dark and silent, tools laid down mid-task, as though their owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never come back. A wall of photographs, faded but preserved in the airless cold, showed hundreds of faces, engineers, welders, scientists, soldiers, all of them working together on something the photographs themselves never quite showed in full. Marcus found on a workstation near the photographs a stack of handwritten letters, their paper gone brittle and yellow with age, tied together with a ribbon that had faded from what might once have been deep red to a pale, washed-out pink. He did not read them, out of some instinct that felt too much like trespassing on a grief that was not his to witness, but he noted the name written across the top letter in careful, looping handwriting, "To my daughter, wherever you are safe tonight." He set them down again exactly as he had found them, and said nothing, though something in his chest had tightened at the thought of some long-dead engineer writing letters to a child she might never see again, in a war that could have ended everything. Elsewhere in the chamber, Tobias discovered a small shrine of sorts, built into an alcove near what had clearly once been a rest area, candles long since burned to nothing, a handful of small personal items left behind, a child's drawing, a wedding ring too small to have belonged to any of the adults whose photographs lined the walls, a pressed flower gone to dust between 2 sheets of cracked protective film. Whoever had built this ship in secret, hidden from a frightened world above, had also lived here, grieved here, hoped here, for however many months or years the project had demanded of them, and the small, human evidence of that hidden life pressed on all 4 of them with a weight none of them had quite expected to feel before setting foot inside. Dr. Osei moved slowly through the room, reading names off the wall of photographs where small plaques had been mounted beneath each face, engineers from every part of Earth, some from nations that no longer existed under the same names, gathered here in secret to build something that history would never properly credit them for. She recognized none of the faces personally, though she searched each one for some resemblance to her grandmother, until, near the far end of the row, she found it. A photograph of a younger Adoise Osei, dark-eyed and serious, standing with one hand resting on the hull of a half-built ship far too large to fit within the frame of the picture, the rest of her disappearing into shadow, the way the whole project itself had disappeared into secrecy for 8 long decades. And at the center of the far wall, carved into the stone itself, in letters that had not faded in 8 decades, a single inscription: "For those who come after us, when the dark returns." Dr. Osei stood before that inscription for a long moment, her breathing ragged over the comm channel, one gloved hand pressed against the cold stone beneath the words, as though she might, through 80 years and the vacuum of space itself, somehow touch the hand that had carved them. "That's her handwriting," she said, very quietly. "I'd know it anywhere. She wrote like that in every letter she ever sent my mother, sharp on the downstrokes." Her voice broke, just slightly, on the last word. She was here. She really was here. Marcus laid a gentle hand on the historian's shoulder, and for a moment, nobody spoke. 4 people standing together in a room built 80 years before, by hands that had known, even then, exactly how badly the future might one day need what they were building. It was Tobias, scanning readouts from a workstation that had, against all odds, sputtered back to partial life, who finally broke the silence, his voice tight with something between disbelief and awe. "There's a door at the far end of this chamber," he said, "bigger than anything else down here, and according to what little I can pull from these old systems before they die again." He stopped, checked the reading twice, and looked up at the others with an expression none of them had seen on his broad, practical face before. "There's still power on the other side of it. Not much. A trickle. Barely enough to keep old lights burning after 80 years. But it's there." Elena felt her heart climbing into her throat. "Open it." The great door at the far end of the chamber was built on a scale entirely different from the small access door they had forced open on the surface, tall enough to admit something far larger than any human vessel Elena had ever served aboard, its surface engraved with the same careful hand that had carved the inscription on the wall behind them, though here the words were fewer, simpler, and somehow more final. Aegis Prime. It took the combined effort of all 4 of them, working the ancient manual mechanisms Dr. Osei's grandmother had built for exactly this eventuality, to force the great door open at last. And when it finally gave way, sliding back into the stone with a groan that echoed through 80 years of silence, the light beyond it fell across a sight that none of them, not Elena, not Marcus, not Tobias with his 30 years of engineering experience, not even Dr. Osei, who had spent 2 years preparing herself for exactly this moment, was truly ready to see. There, filling a cavern hollowed from the heart of the asteroid, on a scale that made the human mind ache to comprehend it, dark and silent and utterly, impossibly real, lay the ship that an entire generation of Earth's children had been told, in bedtime stories meant only to soothe them to sleep, was nothing more than a myth. Aegis Prime was waiting. For the first time in 80 years, somebody had finally come to wake it up. They stood at the threshold for a long moment, none of them quite able to make their legs carry them forward into that vast, dark cavern. Aegis Prime was not merely large. It was large the way a mountain is large, or the way the night sky is large, a scale that made the human body feel suddenly achingly small. Their headlamps, powerful enough to light an entire ship's landing bay under ordinary circumstances, could not begin to find the far end of the hull looming above them. What little the ancient emergency lighting revealed was a hull of dark, matte metal, unmarked by the wear of battle, its surface interrupted here and there by enormous docking clamps that had held the ship motionless and waiting through 8 decades of silence. "I need everyone to breathe," Tobias said, and his voice, usually so steady, carried a tremor Elena had not heard in it before. "Because I am looking at a warship built with technology I don't recognize, on a scale I've never seen outside of Dominion battleships, sitting in a hole in the ground that every star chart in human space calls an abandoned mining claim, and I am one deep breath away from either laughing or being sick, and I would prefer to do neither in a pressure suit." "Take your breath, Chief," Elena said, and found that her own voice was none too steady either. Take two if you need them. They found an entrance eventually. Not the grand, ceremonial opening one might expect for a ship of such size, but a modest crew airlock built into the hull at a height reachable from the cavern floor, clearly intended for exactly the kind of small maintenance team that stood before it now. It took Tobias 20 minutes of careful, patient work, coaxing 80-year-old mechanisms back to reluctant life, with tools he had brought for exactly this purpose, before the airlock finally cycled open, with a hiss of air that had been sealed inside since before any of their grandparents were born. The corridor beyond was dark and cold and utterly still, and yet as they moved through it, headlamps cutting narrow paths through the black, Elena found herself struck again and again by small human details that made the impossible scale of the ship feel suddenly, achingly real. A pair of work gloves left folded neatly on a shelf, a hand-drawn sketch, pinned to a wall, of a child's face, someone's daughter or granddaughter, kept close by someone who had spent months or years of their life sealed inside this ship, building something they hoped their own family would never need. A row of small handprints, pressed into wet paint that had long since dried, signed with names and a date 80 years past, beneath words that read, "We built this so you wouldn't have to." Dr. Osei stopped before that last one, and after a long moment, reached out with one gloved finger to trace the smallest handprint in the row. "That's not my grandmother's," she said softly. "Too small, a child's hand. I wonder whose it was. I wonder if they're still alive somewhere, an old man or woman now, who once pressed their hand into wet paint on a ship they were told to forget." They pressed on, deeper into the ship, following corridors that seemed to stretch without end, until at last they found what could only be the bridge, a wide, circular chamber ringed with dark control stations, a great curved viewport at its center, now looking out on nothing but the dim, rock-hewn walls of the cavern that had held this ship prisoner for 8 decades. It was here, at the central command station, that Tobias found the ship's primary data core, and here that Dr. Osei, hands trembling now for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, finally found what she had crossed the solar system searching for, a small, personal terminal, tucked into an alcove beside the captain's chair, its casing engraved with a single name. Chief Engineer Adaeze Osei. "That's her station," Dr. Osei whispered. "She wasn't just an engineer on this project, she was here, on the bridge, at the end." Tobias worked carefully at the old terminal's failing systems, coaxing power from cells that had held their charge, impossibly, for 80 years, built by hands that had clearly understood they might not return for decades, if ever. While Tobias worked, Elena found herself walking the perimeter of the bridge, running her gloved hand along control stations that had once been crewed by people whose names she would likely never know, people who had sat exactly where she now stood, watching the same stars through the same viewport, waiting for a war to end or begin. A faded label beneath one console read simply, "Navigation, Second Watch," the handwriting different from the sharp, careful script she had already come to associate with Adaeze Osei, a reminder that this ship had been more than one woman's creation, however central her role, but the work of hundreds of hands united, briefly and desperately, by a threat large enough to make old rivalries feel suddenly, achingly small. Marcus, meanwhile, had found a smaller station near the rear of the bridge, its surface still bearing a faded sticker in a child's careful printing, though clearly placed there by an adult crew member with a sense of humor even in the darkest days of the war. "Best seat on the ship, do not argue." He found himself smiling at it despite everything, a small human joke left behind by someone who had never expected any of it to be found again. And he wondered, not for the first time since they had entered this vast, silent ship, how many small kindnesses like this one might still be waiting in its corridors, unremembered, for 80 years. It was Tobias who finally broke the quiet, still hunched over the old terminal, his voice hushed with something between exhaustion and discovery. "There's a log," he said, his voice hushed. "Recorded messages, dozens of them. The last ones dated 80 years ago, 3 days before the Vanguard War ended." He looked up at Dr. Osei, and something gentle crossed his broad, tired face. "Doc, I think this is for you." Dr. Osei sat down slowly in the chair before her grandmother's terminal. The same chair, she realized with a small private shock. that Aegis must have sat in 80 years before, in the final desperate days of a war that had nearly ended humanity before it ever properly began among the stars. She activated the log with hands that had gone completely steady now, as though some deep, old part of her had been waiting her entire life for exactly this moment. The voice that filled the bridge was older than Dr. Osei remembered from the few recordings she had inherited after her grandmother's death, tired in a way that went deeper than simple exhaustion, but unmistakably, achingly familiar. The same voice that had read her mother bedtime stories, translated now into a message meant for a future its speaker could not have known would ever arrive. If anyone is hearing this, the recording began, then either Aegis Prime has finally been needed, or someone has broken into a very well-hidden hole in an asteroid, for reasons I cannot begin to guess at. Either way, hello, my name is Aegis Osei. 80 years ago, as I record this, humanity is losing a war it never asked to fight. The recording continued, and as it played, the small group gathered on the bridge of Aegis Prime learned, for the first time in most of their lives, the true history of the Vanguard War, not the sanitized version taught in schools, the one that spoke of humanity's darkest hour and greatest triumph in the same careful, distant language used for tragedies too large to look at directly, but the raw, unpolished truth, as one exhausted engineer had recorded it in the last days before the ending she could not yet know was coming. 80 years before, Earth had made its first true contact with life beyond its own solar system, not the careful, diplomatic first contact humanity had always imagined and hoped for, but a sudden, violent arrival of a hostile force the survivors had come to call simply the Ravagers, a fleet of unknown origin that appeared without warning and began systematically stripping Earth's outer colonies for resources, meeting any resistance with overwhelming, merciless force. In the span of 18 months, humanity lost every colony it had established beyond its own solar system, and watched, helpless, as the Ravager fleet turned its attention toward Earth itself. We had nothing that could stop them, Adese's recorded voice said. Every nation on Earth had spent the previous century arguing over borders and resources that suddenly meant nothing at all. It took the Ravagers burning 3 of our colonies to the ground before the governments of Earth finally understood that none of us were going to survive this by fighting each other for advantage. The Global Unity Accords were signed 11 months into the war, out of desperation, not idealism, though I like to think some idealism crept into it eventually, and with that unity came, for the first time, the resources and the will to build something none of us had ever dared imagine before. She described in careful and exhausted detail the arguments that had nearly derailed the project more than once in its first year. Disagreements over which nation would house the primary shipyard, over whose scientists would lead which division. Arguments that had cost precious weeks, even as the Ravager fleet advanced steadily closer to Earth itself. I want to be honest about this too, Adese's voice said, because I think the sanitized histories that will eventually be written about this war, if any of us survive to write them, will smooth over how close we came to losing this project to our own stubbornness, before the enemy ever had the chance to destroy it. We were still, in some ways, children ourselves, fighting over the same old disputes even as the house burned down around us. It took the loss of a third colony, one I will not name here because too many of the people who died there still have family, who does not yet know the full truth of how it happened, before the last holdout nations finally signed the accords and let the real work begin. I do not say this to shame anyone, the recording continued. I say it because I think whoever finds this ship deserves to know that unity, when it finally came, was hard-won and imperfect, built by frightened, grieving, sometimes selfish people who nonetheless found a way, in the end, to set enough of that fear and grief aside to build something greater than any of them could have built alone. If Earth is facing a threat serious enough that someone has come looking for this ship, I hope that same kind of unity is possible for you now, whatever divides your own generation. I hope it does not take losing a colony to remind you of it. Aegis Prime, the recording explained, had been built in a global effort unlike anything in human history, every nation contributing what it could, every remaining resource poured into a single, desperate project, based on salvaged Ravager technology, recovered from a single, miraculous battle, where an outnumbered human defense fleet had managed to cripple one of the enemy's smaller vessels before it self-destructed. That salvage technology, combined with humanity's own hurried, war-driven innovations, had become the foundation for a ship unlike anything Earth, or, as it would turn out, much of the wider galaxy, had ever built. "We built her to end the war," Adauze's voice said. "Not to conquer, not to expand, only to survive. I want whoever is listening to this to understand that clearly, because I fear what might happen if this ship is ever used for anything else. Aegis Prime is not a symbol of what humanity can conquer. She is a symbol of what humanity will do, when there is truly no other choice left, to protect the people we love." The recording described the ship's final deployment, in the last month of the war, when the Ravager fleet had gathered for what everyone on Earth believed would be humanity's final battle. A last, desperate stand, meant only to slow the enemy's advance long enough for as many people as possible to reach shelter. Aegis Prime's arrival in that battle, the recording said, had been the single deciding factor. Her weapons and shields, technology decades ahead of anything either side had fielded before, turning a hopeless defeat into a total, decisive victory that ended the war within a single day. "We won," Adaizi's voice said, and here, for the first time, it broke, just slightly, with an emotion that had clearly cost her a great deal to record. "We won, and it cost us everything. 6 billion people died in the 18 months before Aegis Prime was ready. 6 billion, out of a species that had never imagined losing so much as a single city to war before the Ravagers came. We won the war, and every single person on Earth who survived it spent the rest of their lives wondering if we could have won it faster, if we could have saved more, if the 20 months we spent arguing over borders before the Global Unity Accords had cost us more lives than any battle ever could." It was this grief, the recording explained, more than any fear of the weapon itself, that had driven the surviving Council of Nations to make the decision that followed the war's end. To hide Aegis Prime, to erase her from every official record, to let the story of her existence fade slowly into myth and bedtime story, rather than risk a future where humanity, remembering how decisively she had won that final battle, might reach for her again too quickly, too easily, the next time some dispute grew large enough to tempt them toward war instead of unity. "We did not hide her out of shame," Odysseus' voice said, quieter now, nearing the recording's end. "We hid her because peace is fragile, and terribly easy to break, once a people remember they possess the power to break it. I have spent every day since the war ended, hoping that no one would ever need to find this recording. If you are hearing it now, then I am sorry, sorrier than I have words to properly say, that the peace we fought so hard to build did not last forever. But I am not sorry that we built her. Whatever brought you here, whatever danger Earth faces now, that made this secret worth uncovering, I trust you to remember what she is for. Not conquest, not vengeance. Only the protection of people who have run out of any other way to protect themselves." The recording ended there, 80 years of silence, and for a long moment, nobody on the bridge of Aegis Prime spoke at all. Dr. Osei sat very still before her grandmother's terminal, tears running freely inside her helmet now, unashamed. "She knew," she said finally. "She knew someone would need to hear this someday. She just didn't know when." "She knew it would be someone who needed her reasons explained carefully," Elena said quietly, laying a gentle hand on the old historian's shoulder. "Someone who'd have to decide whether to wake this ship up for the right reasons, and not just because it was powerful. She was talking to us, Dr. Osei. 80 years ago, she was already talking to us." The wonder of the recording gave way, before long, to the practical urgency of their situation, and it was Tobias who brought them back to it, his voice gentle but firm. "I hate to be the one to say it," he said, "but we've got 30 days minus however many we've already spent getting here, and a Dominion invasion fleet on the other end of that clock. I need to know if this ship can actually fly, and I need to know it fast." It took the better part of a full day, working in shifts, catching sleep in short, uneasy stretches in the ship's ancient crew quarters, for Tobias to complete even a preliminary assessment of Aegis Prime's condition, assisted by Dr. Osei's careful translation of her grandmother's technical notes, and by Elena and Marcus, who had spent the journey aboard the Meridian, learning enough of the fundamentals to serve as useful hands, rather than simply worried bystanders. The news, when it came, was neither as good as they had hoped, nor as bad as they had feared. "The hull's intact," Tobias reported, gathering them around a data display he had managed to coax back to partial function. "Better than intact, whatever alloy your grandmother's team used, Doc. It's held up 80 years in vacuum without so much as a stress fracture. Same with most of the primary systems. Life support, gravity, basic ship systems. They've been running this whole time on a trickle from an auxiliary power source, which is honestly a small miracle of engineering all on its own." "But," Elena said, hearing the word coming before Tobias said it. "But the main reactor's been shut down," Tobias confirmed. "Not damaged, shut down. Deliberately, carefully. The way you'd power down a system you meant to leave off for a very long time. Somebody removed key components before they sealed this place up. Not enough to make the ship unrecoverable, but enough to make sure nobody could just walk in and wake her up by accident." Dr. Osei nodded slowly. "My grandmother would have insisted on that. A ship this powerful, left fully operational and hidden for decades, the risk of it falling into the wrong hands, or simply malfunctioning after years of neglect, would have terrified her far more than the risk of it being unusable when actually needed." "So we need the missing components," Marcus said. "Where are they?" Tobias pulled up a schematic, old and water-damaged in places, that Dr. Osei's tablet had preserved among her grandmother's records. "According to this, there's a secondary storage vault, deeper in the facility, built specifically to hold the reactor's core regulators, the pieces that were removed. If they're still there, still intact after 80 years, we might actually be able to do this. Might." "And if they're not there?" Elena asked. "Then we're looking at trying to fabricate replacement parts from scratch, using technology none of us fully understand, in however many days we've got left before the Dominion runs out of patience," Tobias said, "which, for the record, I would very much rather not attempt." They found the vault by the end of the second day, sealed behind a door as heavy and deliberate as the one that had guarded the ship itself. And here, at last, the mission's fortunes turned decisively in their favor. The regulators were exactly where the schematics promised, carefully preserved in sealed containment cases that had protected them from 80 years of dust and decay, exactly as their absent creator had planned. "They're intact," Tobias said, his voice thick with something between relief and disbelief, as he ran diagnostic scans over each carefully preserved component. "I don't fully understand how half of this technology works. I'll be honest with you all, but everything I can test reads clean. If we can get these installed and calibrated correctly, and if the main reactor itself has held up as well as everything else on this ship." "How long?" Elena asked. "Installation and calibration, best guess." Tobias considered the question seriously, the way a man considers a question he knows people's lives depend on answering honestly. "Working around the clock, with the four of us and whatever help Priya can offer from the Meridian systems. 5 days, maybe 6 if something goes wrong that I'm not expecting, which, given that we're working on 80-year-old alien-derived technology none of us have ever seen before, I would call likely rather than unlikely. We don't have 6 days to spare and still make it back to Earth before the ultimatum expires," Marcus said quietly. Doing the math they had all, silently, already begun doing themselves. "No," Tobias agreed. "We probably don't. But I don't see another option in front of us, so I suggest we start working and worry about the calendar as we go." They began that same hour, and over the days that followed, fell into an exhausting, focused rhythm of work that left little room for anything but the task in front of them. Tobias directing the technical installation, with Dr. Osei's grandmother's notes spread across every available surface. Marcus and Elena serving as extra hands for work too heavy or too delicate for one person alone, all 4 of them running on too little sleep and too much hope, racing against a clock that, far above them on a world none of them had seen in over a week, continued its steady, uncaring countdown toward war. While Aegis Prime's ancient systems slowly, painstakingly came back to life, deep within the asteroid belt, the world the small team had left behind was coming apart at the seams, one anxious day at a time. General Reyes had spent the better part of a week fielding demands from every corner of the Council of Nations, each government pulling in a different direction as the Dominion's 30-day deadline burned steadily shorter. Some delegates, representing nations that remembered too well the cost of the Vanguard War, argued forcefully for accepting the Dominion's terms. Better, they said, a humbled Earth that survived, than a defiant Earth reduced to rubble for the sake of pride. Others, younger nations that had joined the fold of human unity only in the decades since Earth first reached the stars, argued just as forcefully that submission today would only be the first of many demands tomorrow, that the Dominion's own history among the stars showed a pattern of vassal worlds slowly stripped of everything that made them worth conquering in the first place. Reyes, bound by his promise to Elena and the others, could tell none of them the true reason he continued, day after day, to argue for patience, for delay, for just a little more time before Earth gave its final answer to the Dominion's ultimatum. "You ask us to simply wait," said the delegate from the newly resettled nation of Meridia, in one particularly heated session that Reyes attended by holographic link, from a secure office, 3 levels below the Fleet Command Building's public floors. "While the Dominion's fleet grows closer every day, and you offer no plan beyond the same 43 ships that could not save Kepler's landing. What exactly are we waiting for, General?" "For time to work in our favor rather than against it," Reyes said, which was true, if carefully incomplete. "I understand every argument being made in this chamber. I have made several of them myself, in darker moments. But I ask each of you to remember that the Dominion offered 30 days for a reason. Threx does not fear our 43 ships. He fears what might happen if Earth's people are given time to find their resolve rather than their fear. I would ask this council not to hand him that fear for free, before the 30 days he himself allowed us have even run their course." It was not quite enough to fully quiet the growing calls for surrender, but it bought, day by day, exactly what Reyes needed most: time. Across Earth, that time passed in a mood of gathering dread that touched every corner of the world. In cities from Lagos to Manila to Sao Paulo, people gathered in public squares to watch news broadcasts that offered no good answers, only the same grim countdown, the same uncertain debate playing out again and again on 100 different channels. Shelters that had not seen use since the last uneasy years of rebuilding after the Vanguard War were quietly reopened and restocked. Parents found themselves, in the small hours of the night, having conversations with their children that no parent should ever have to have, trying to explain a danger that even the adults in the room did not fully understand themselves. In one such city, in a small apartment overlooking a harbor not unlike the one outside Reyes's own office window, an elderly woman named Grace Okonkwo sat with her granddaughter on a narrow balcony, watching the lights of passing ships far below, and found herself, without quite meaning to, telling the child an old story her own mother had once told her. A story about a great sleeping ship, hidden somewhere among the stars, that would wake up when Earth needed it most. "Is it true, Grandma?" the little girl asked, the way children always ask about the stories that matter most to them. Grace considered the question for a long moment before she answered. She had been 11 years old when the Vanguard War ended, old enough to remember, faintly, the terror of those final months, though she had been too young, at the time, to understand exactly what had been lost. "I don't know if it's true," she said finally, "but I know that when I was your age, everyone believed our world was about to end, and then, somehow, it didn't. I choose to believe that stories like that one exist, because something in us needs to remember that the darkest moment is not always the last one." It was a small moment, one of billions playing out across a frightened world in those uncertain days, and it would never appear in any official record of what came to be called, in the years that followed, the Second Vanguard Crisis. But it captured, in its quiet way, exactly what General Reyes was fighting to protect. With every day of delay he wrung from an increasingly impatient council of nations, not simply a world, but the fragile, essential hope that a world needed to keep believing in itself, even when the numbers said it shouldn't. Reyes did not know, as he fought that daily battle in windowless chambers far from the stars, whether the hope he was buying time for would ever be repaid. He only knew that somewhere out past Mars, in an asteroid field the star charts called worthless, 4 people he had sent with nothing more than an old woman's family secret and a great deal of courage were, even now, working around the clock to find out. In the fleet's public affairs office, A young officer named Captain Ilhan Demir spent those same anxious days fielding a different kind of pressure entirely. Thousands of messages arriving hourly from ordinary citizens across Earth, some angry, demanding to know why their government seemed to be doing nothing, while the Dominion's deadline burned down, some frightened, asking whether it was safe to send their children to school, a handful, strange and persistent, asking with a hope that bordered on desperate, whether there was any truth to the old story about a sleeping ship that would save them all. Demir had no answer to give any of them, bound by the same secrecy that bound Reyes himself, and found the not answering harder, some days, than any battle he had trained for. Across the ocean, in a small coastal town that had rebuilt itself twice since the Vanguard War, a retired schoolteacher named Henrik Voss organized a nightly vigil in the town square. Not out of any particular faith that it would change anything, he would tell reporters who came to ask, but because he remembered, as a boy of 9 during the darkest months of the Vanguard War, how much it had mattered to stand shoulder to shoulder with his neighbors under the stars, waiting together for news that might never come, rather than facing the waiting alone behind a locked door. Hundreds of towns like his, in every country left on Earth, held similar vigils in those uncertain days, small, quiet acts of shared hope that no historian would ever fully record, though they mattered, in their way, every bit as much as the fleet maneuvers and council debates that filled the official histories. None of them knew, gathered in town squares or huddled over anxious messages to a public affairs office that had no comfort left to offer, that far past Mars, in a hole in an asteroid that had waited 80 years to be found, 4 exhausted people were working around the clock to give their hope somewhere real to land. On the 6th day of repairs, with Aegis Prime's reactor regulators finally installed and Tobias beginning the slow, careful process of calibration that would determine whether 80 years of patient engineering had truly paid off, Priya's voice crackled urgently over the comm system linking the Meridian to the team working deep inside the asteroid. "Captain, I've got a contact," she said, her voice tight with tension. "Dominion scout ship. Small. Fast. The same class we evaded on the way in. It's changed course. I think it picked up something. Engine heat, maybe. Venting from the reactor work, or a sensor ghost from all the power we've been running through Aegis Prime's systems. It's heading straight for the asteroid." Elena's blood went cold. "ETA? 20 minutes. Maybe less." Tobias looked up from his work, hands still deep in an open access panel, his face a portrait of a man calculating impossible odds. "I am not remotely finished," he said. "If that scout gets a close scan of this asteroid, there's no story about mineral surveys that's going to explain what it finds." "Then it doesn't get a close scan," Elena said, already moving. "Marcus, with me. We're going back to the Meridian. If that scout comes in for a proper look, we need to be ready to either talk our way past it, or make sure it never gets close enough to report what it sees." "And if it's already too close to talk our way past?" Marcus asked, following her at a run through the darkened corridors of the ancient ship. "Then we make sure it doesn't get home," Elena said, and did not allow herself to think too hard about exactly what that might require. They reached the Meridian with minutes to spare, and Elena took the pilot's chair herself, Marcus at weapons, both of them falling into the old, practiced rhythm of a crew that had trained together for years, even though the Meridian carried nothing more than a single defensive turret, hastily installed before departure, and never meant for real combat. The Dominion scout came in low over the asteroid's cratered surface, running a slow, careful search pattern that told Elena immediately this was no random patrol. Priya was right. Something had drawn its attention directly to Site 12. "Hailing us," Priya reported. "Put it through," Elena said, and did her best imitation of Dr. Osei's steady, bored civilian voice from the encounter days before. "Unidentified vessel. This is the survey ship Meridian. We're conducting a mineral density scan of this claim under Concord trade permit." "Meridian," the voice on the other end cut her off, younger and sharper than the bored patrol officer from before. "Your registered survey coordinates do not include this sector. Explain your presence, or prepare to be boarded." Elena's mind raced. There was no story left that would explain both their unauthorized position and the faint, unmistakable energy readings that must, even now, be bleeding out from Aegis Prime's reactor deep within the asteroid. We picked up an unusual mineral signature and diverted to investigate. She tried anyway, buying every second she could. We were just about to file an amended. Scans show a structural anomaly consistent with an artificial excavation. The Dominion officer interrupted, and Elena heard, with a sinking heart, the exact moment the scout's sensors found what Priya had feared they might. This is not a mining survey. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding, or we will treat this as hostile activity in a restricted sector. There was no more time for stories. Marcus, Elena said quietly, target their engines. Not to destroy, to disable. We cannot let that ship report our position, but I am not giving the order to kill a crew over a sensor reading, if there's any other way. Marcus's hands moved fast and sure over the weapons controls. Years of training compressed into a single, critical moment, and the Meridian's small defensive turret fired a precise burst that caught the Dominion Scout's engine housing exactly as Elena had ordered, crippling its ability to maneuver, or flee, without so much as scratching its hull. But even as the scout ship spun, powerless, away from the asteroid, its crew already scrambling for backup systems, Priya's voice came through again, grimmer this time. Captain, they got a burst transmission out before we hit them. Short range, but it'll have reached the nearest Dominion relay station. They know something's here. They don't know what, not exactly, but they know it's worth investigating, and it won't take them long to send someone with better sensors and worse patience than a single scout ship to come find out. Elena closed her eyes for one long moment, feeling the weight of what that meant settle over her. The careful secrecy Reyes had insisted on, the 30 days of borrowed time, all of it, suddenly, running out far faster than any of them had planned for. How long do we have, she asked, though some part of her already knew the answer would not be one she wanted to hear. I don't know, Priya said. Hours, maybe a day, if we're lucky. Whatever's coming next, Captain, it's coming soon. Elena sat with that answer for a long moment, feeling the full weight of it settle into her chest. Somewhere behind her, through the reinforced hull of the Meridian, the cratered surface of Site 12 continued its slow tumble through the dark, indifferent to the sudden, desperate urgency of the people working inside it. She thought of Reyes, holding the line of Earth's patience against a council of nations that grew more frightened by the day, spending political capital he did not have, to buy time he had no way of knowing whether they would actually use. She thought of her father, and of every choice that had led her to this exact moment, and found, beneath the fear, something that felt almost like relief. Whatever happened next, at least they would meet it having tried everything they possibly could. Deep within the asteroid, in the ancient bridge of a ship that had waited 80 years to be needed, Tobias looked up from his work, at the sound of Elena's voice relaying the news, his hands going very still over the open reactor housing in front of him. Well, he said quietly, into the sudden, heavy silence of the bridge, I suppose that answers the question of whether we finish this in 5 days or 5 hours. Above them, in the dark between the stars, something was already turning its attention toward the small, forgotten corner of the asteroid belt where humanity's oldest secret lay half awake and unfinished, and the countdown that had once measured itself in weeks had, in the space of a single burst transmission, collapsed down to something far more urgent and far more dangerous than any of them had been ready for. Elena did not need to call a meeting to know what had to happen next. The moment Priya's warning reached the ancient bridge of Aegis Prime, every person aboard understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the careful, methodical pace of the last 6 days had just run out, along with their remaining margin for error. Tobias, she said, how close are you really? Not the answer you'd give the Council of Nations, the truth. Tobias wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had long since stopped being clean, considering the question with the same careful honesty he had given every question since the mission began. Reactor regulators are installed and reading stable, he said. Calibrations may be 60% done. I could probably force an early activation if I had to. Get her basic systems and point defense weapons online faster than a full, careful startup would allow. But I'd be doing it blind, without the safety margins I'd normally insist on, and I won't pretend that's not a risk to everyone standing in this ship when I do it. How much of a risk? Marcus asked. Enough that I wouldn't recommend it, Tobias said, if we had literally any other choice in front of us. We don't, Elena said. It was not a question. Dr. Osi, who had been quiet through the exchange, spoke up from where she sat before her grandmother's terminal, still working through decades-old technical notes, with the patient focus of a woman who had spent her whole career learning to extract meaning from incomplete records. "There's something in my grandmother's notes about emergency activation protocols," she said, "built for exactly this scenario, a situation where the ship needed defensive capability before full calibration was complete. It's not meant to be a permanent solution, but it might buy us hours we wouldn't otherwise have." "Then let's use it," Elena said. "Tobias, work with Dr. Ose on emergency activation. Marcus, you're with me. We're taking the Meridian out to run early warning picket duty. If something bigger than that scout is coming, I want us to see it before it sees us. And I want enough warning to get everyone off this rock if it comes to that." "Elena," Marcus started, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him directly. "If something bigger is coming and Aegis Prime isn't ready, running picket duty in the Meridian isn't a delay tactic. It's a suicide run." "It's the job," Elena said simply. "Someone has to do it, and I am not asking anyone else on this crew to fly a mission I'm not willing to fly myself." "Then I'm flying it with you," Marcus said, and there was no room in his voice for argument. The same steady certainty she remembered from the day they had both agreed, without hesitation, to follow Dr. Ose's impossible hope into the dark. Elena looked at her brother for a long moment, 24 years old, 8 months out of training, standing in the corridor of a ship built for a war neither of them had lived through, volunteering without a second thought to fly directly into whatever danger was coming, and felt something that was equal parts pride and terror twist through her chest. "All right," she said finally. "Let's go to work." They left Tobias and Dr. Ose bent together over the ancient reactor controls, murmuring back and forth in the careful shorthand of two people who had, over 6 days of shared exhausting labor, come to trust each other's judgment completely, and made their way back through the darkened corridors of Aegis Prime toward the surface and the small, waiting shape of the Meridian. "Do you think it'll work?" Marcus asked, as they crossed the asteroid's broken surface in the strange, bounding steps of low gravity. "The emergency activation? I think Dr. Ose's grandmother built this ship to survive exactly this kind of desperate moment," Elena said. "I choose to believe she planned for us to need shortcuts. And if she didn't?" Elena considered the question seriously, the way she always tried to answer Marcus's hardest questions, even when the honest answer offered no comfort at all. "Then we'll have done everything we could with the time we had," she said, "and that will have to be enough, because it's all any of us have ever really been able to offer." They flew in silence for a while after that, the Meridian's small cockpit lit only by the soft glow of instrument panels, the vast dark of the asteroid belt sliding past outside, in slow, indifferent majesty. Marcus found himself thinking of every training simulation he had ever run, every scenario his instructors had walked him through in the safety of a classroom, and realizing, not for the first time since joining the Defiance crew 8 months before, how little any of that training had actually prepared him for the particular quality of fear that came with genuinely not knowing whether the next hour would end in triumph or disaster. "Elena," he said after a while, "if something happens out here, I want you to know, I don't regret coming, any of it. Not Kepler's landing, not this. I know I complained about you being overprotective for about 6 years straight, but I understood, even when I complained, that you were trying to keep me safe, because you'd already lost one person you loved to this fight, and you didn't want to lose another." Elena did not answer right away, keeping her eyes on the sensor readouts in front of her, though something in her chest had tightened at his words. "I never regretted the overprotective part," she said finally. "I just wish I'd been better at explaining why, instead of just being annoying about it." Marcus laughed, a short, surprised sound that eased some of the tension in the small cockpit. "You were definitely annoying about it, but I get it now. I think I've gotten it since Kepler's landing, honestly. There's no version of loving someone that doesn't come with wanting to keep them safe, even when you know you can't actually promise that." "When did you get so wise?" Elena asked, glancing at him with something that might have been the ghost of a proud smile. 8 months of watching you fly," Marcus said. "Some of it had to rub off eventually." They had been running picket duty for less than 3 hours when the Meridian's sensors picked up the first sign of trouble. Not the small, single scout they had disabled the day before, but a formation of 6 ships, moving fast and direct towards Site 12, with none of the careful, searching pattern of a routine patrol. "That's not a scout," Priya said, her voice tight over the comm from where she monitored long-range sensors aboard the Meridian, alongside Elena and Marcus. "That's a strike force. 6 ships, moving in tight formation, weapons already charged if I'm reading these signatures right." Elena's blood went cold. "ETA to Site 12? 40 minutes, maybe less at their current speed. 40 minutes. Elena ran the numbers in her head, fast and cold. 40 minutes was nowhere near enough time for Tobias to complete even an emergency activation, let alone bring Aegis Prime's full defensive systems online. 40 minutes was barely enough time to warn the others, let alone prepare any meaningful defense against 6 armed Dominion vessels. "Get Tobias on comm," she said. "Now." Tobias's voice crackled through a moment later, tight with the same tension Elena felt tightening in her own chest. "I heard," he said, before she could even explain. "Dr. Osei and I can have emergency point defense online, in maybe 20 minutes if we push it, which is not the timeline I would have chosen given the choice. But choices are apparently a luxury we've run out of." "Do it," Elena said. "Marcus and I will hold that strike force off as long as we can." With 1 lightly armed survey vessel against 6 Dominion warships, Tobias's voice carried a disbelief that, under any other circumstances, might have been laced with dark humor. "Captain, I admire your confidence, but that math does not work in our favor, no matter how you run it." "I know," Elena said, "but 20 minutes is 20 minutes, Tobias, and I intend to buy every second of it I can." What followed was, by any honest accounting, one of the most desperate hours of Elena Cross's life. The Meridian, built for quiet survey work and never intended for real combat, could not hope to match 6 Dominion warships in any straightforward engagement, and so Elena did not attempt one, instead using every trick of evasion and misdirection she had ever learned in 6 years of fleet command, weaving the small ship through the tumbling debris field surrounding Site 12, using the asteroid's own broken terrain as cover, striking at the Dominion formation's edges when opportunities appeared, and vanishing back into the shadow of tumbling rock before any of the 6 warships could bring their full weapons to bear. "They're adjusting formation," Marcus reported, hands flying across the weapons and sensor controls with a speed and precision that spoke to just how far he had come in 8 months of service. "I think they've figured out we're trying to delay them rather than actually fight them head-on." "Then we adjust too," Elena said, banking the Meridian hard around the shadow of a massive tumbling rock, close enough that its jagged surface scraped audibly along their outer hull. "Tobias, status?" 15 minutes. Tobias's voice came back, strained with effort. "I need 15 more minutes, Captain, and I am doing everything humanly possible to make it less than that." The Dominion formation, having adjusted its approach, began splitting into 2 groups, 3 ships continuing directly towards Site 12's hidden entrance, 3 more breaking off to hunt down the small survey vessel that had been harassing their advance. Elena watched the tactical display with a sinking heart, understanding immediately what the split meant. The Dominion commander leading this strike force had decided the Meridian was worth dealing with properly, rather than simply ignoring. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to take manual control of point defense. I'm going to try something that is going to feel, from where you're sitting, like a very bad idea." "Elena, whatever it is, there's no time to explain. Just trust me," she said, and threw the Meridian into a dive directly toward the asteroid's surface, aiming for a narrow debris channel that no sane pilot would attempt to navigate at anything above a crawl, let alone under fire from 3 pursuing warships. It very nearly worked. The Meridian threaded the narrow channel with a precision that made Marcus, even in the terror of the moment, feel a flash of pure professional admiration for his sister's flying. And then one of the pursuing Dominion ships, faster and more reckless than its companions, clipped the edge of the debris field trying to follow, sending a spray of broken rock tumbling directly into the Meridian's path. Marcus saw it coming a half-second before Elena did, and threw himself across the small cockpit to grab the emergency shielding controls, diverting every available erg of power to the ship's forward deflectors in the instant before impact, a choice that saved the Meridian from catastrophic hull breach, but left the exposed weapons station where he had been sitting a moment before, without any protection at all, when a secondary piece of debris, smaller but still moving at devastating speed, tore through the outer hull, exactly where his chair had been. The Meridian shuddered violently, alarms blaring, and Elena, fighting the controls with every ounce of skill she possessed to bring the ship back under control, heard her brother cry out in pain behind her. "Marcus! I'm okay," Marcus gasped, though his voice carried a raw edge of pain that told her he was very much not okay. "I'm okay. Just keep flying, Elena. I've got this. Keep us moving." Blood was already soaking through his sleeve, where a jagged piece of debris had torn across his shoulder and upper arm, but he stayed at his station, teeth gritted, one hand pressed hard against the wound, while the other continued, with visibly shaking precision, to work the point defense controls that were, at that moment, the only thing standing between the crippled Meridian and total destruction. 14 minutes, Elena said grimly, checking the timer Tobias had given them what felt like a lifetime ago, though barely a minute had actually passed. "Marcus, hold on. Just hold on a little longer." The final minutes of that desperate engagement passed in a blur that Elena would only fully reconstruct later, piecing together fragments of memory that felt, even at the time, too fast and too terrible to process as they happened. She flew the wounded Meridian through maneuvers she would never have attempted under any circumstances she could have planned for, buying seconds and then minutes, with nothing but skill and desperation, while Marcus, bleeding heavily now but refusing every order to abandon his station, kept the ship's single-point defense turret firing with an accuracy that seemed, in the moment, like something close to a miracle. 10 minutes, she called out, and then, an eternity later, 8. It was at 6 minutes remaining, with the Meridian's shields failing, and 2 of the 3 pursuing Dominion ships closing for what would clearly be a final, decisive strike, that Tobias's voice crackled back over the comm, ragged with exhaustion, and something that might have been relief. "Emergency activation complete," he said. "Point defense is online. Captain, get clear. I am about to make those 3 ships very unhappy." Elena did not need to be told twice. She threw the Meridian into a hard, punishing turn away from the asteroid's surface, putting as much distance as the crippled ship could manage between herself and Site 12, and a moment later, the darkness around them lit up with a brilliance that outshone the distant sun itself, as Aegis Prime, 80 years dormant and barely more than half repaired, opened fire on the Dominion strike force with weapons that had not been fired since the final battle of a war, fought before any of their grandparents were born. The battle, such as it was, ended in less than 30 seconds. Aegis Prime's point defense systems, built to withstand and repel threats on a scale the Dominion Strike Force's commanders could not possibly have imagined when they set out on what they believed was a routine investigation, tore through all 6 Dominion vessels with a speed and precision that left no doubt, to anyone watching, about the true nature of what had been hidden in that asteroid field for 8 decades. When it was over, when the wreckage of the Dominion strike force had scattered into cooling debris and the ancient weapons finally fell silent, Elena brought the battered Meridian back down onto the asteroid's surface, with hands that would not stop shaking, and turned immediately to her brother, who had finally, now that the immediate danger had passed, allowed himself to slump against his console, pale and bleeding and utterly spent. "Marcus." She was at his side in an instant, tearing open the emergency medical kit with hands that fumbled with fear, even as her training took over, assessing the wound with the ease of long practice, even through the terror clawing at her chest. The cut across his shoulder was deep, ragged from the debris that had caused it, but it had missed anything vital, and the bleeding, while significant, was not the catastrophic kind that would have told her she was about to lose him. "Told you I was okay," Marcus managed, through gritted teeth, as she worked to stabilize the wound. "You are not okay," Elena said, her voice rough with an emotion she did not try to hide. "You are bleeding through a shirt, Marcus. That is the opposite of okay." "I'm alive," he said, more quietly. "That counts as pretty okay, all things considered." By the time Tobias and Dr. Osei reached the Meridian, having made their own way across the asteroid's surface the moment the immediate danger had passed, moving with a speed that belied Tobias's exhausted 60-year-old frame, Elena had gotten the wound properly dressed, and Marcus stabilized enough to sit upright, pale but alert, insisting with visible irritation that he did not need to be carried anywhere. Point defense held, Tobias reported, still catching his breath from the crossing. Barely. I had maybe 4 minutes of margin before that emergency activation would have started drawing more power than the partially calibrated reactor could safely provide. We got lucky. We got lucky because you and Dr. Osei worked a miracle in 20 minutes. That should have taken hours, Elena said. Don't undersell it. Dr. Osei, kneeling beside Marcus to check his dressing with the careful attention of someone who had, over 6 days, come to think of this crew as something closer to family than colleagues, looked up with an expression that mixed relief and grim calculation in equal measure. That strike force got a transmission out before we destroyed them, she said quietly. I'd wager everything I have that it did, the same as the scout before them, which means the Dominion Command now knows, beyond any doubt, that something extraordinarily powerful is hidden in this asteroid field. Which means whatever's coming next won't be 6 ships sent to investigate, Elena said, following the grim logic to its inevitable conclusion. It'll be everything Threx can spare, sent to make absolutely certain we never get the chance to finish what we've started. Tobias nodded slowly, wiping sweat and grease from his face with a hand that trembled, just slightly, from exhaustion and the lingering shock of how close the last hour had come to ending everything. Then I suppose, he said, there's no time left for anything but the work. Far above the quiet devastation of the asteroid belt, on a world that had spent the last week and a half holding its breath, General Reyes received the news he had been dreading since the moment he first authorized Elena's mission. The Corvette Dominion fleet, gathered for the past several days at the edge of Earth's solar system under the pretense of routine positioning ahead of the ultimatum's expiration, had begun moving inward, weapons charged, formation tightening into the unmistakable shape of an invasion rather than a demonstration. They're not waiting for the 30 days, Reyes said, staring at the tactical display in the Fleet Command Building's central war room, where every screen now showed the same grim confirmation from a dozen different sensor arrays scattered across Earth's system. Threx said 30 days in that council chamber, in front of the entire Concord. Why break his own deadline now? The answer came less than an hour later, in the form of an intercepted Dominion communication that told Reyes everything he needed to know about why the invasion had suddenly accelerated. A strike force sent to investigate an unusual power signature in the outer asteroid belt had failed to report in, following a brief, garbled transmission describing weapons technology beyond anything in the Dominion's own arsenal. They found them, Reyes said quietly, understanding immediately what it meant. Not that Elena's team had failed, but that they had succeeded well enough to force Threx's hand early, before Earth's oldest secret could be fully readied for the fight ahead. Or near enough to it that Threx isn't willing to wait and find out what else Earth might be hiding. There was no more time for careful diplomacy, no more sessions of the Council of Nations arguing over surrender or resistance. The Dominion fleet was coming, in numbers that dwarfed anything Earth's 43 ships could hope to match, and Reyes, standing in the war room that had been his second home for over 2 decades of service, gave the only order left available to him. Full mobilization, every ship Earth possessed, every reserve crew called to duty, a defense mounted, not because anyone believed it could win, but because the alternative was to let Earth fall, without even the dignity of having tried. All ships, this is General Reyes, he said, his voice carried across every channel the United Earth Fleet maintained, to crews who had spent their whole lives training for a moment none of them had ever truly believed would come. The Dominion fleet is moving on Earth. I will not stand here and tell you the numbers favor us, because they do not, and every one of you has trained long enough to know that already. What I will tell you is this. For 80 years, this world has quietly believed that if the darkness ever came for us again, someone, somewhere, would have already found a way to meet it. I do not know, as I speak to you now, whether that hope will be answered in time, but I know that the people of this world are watching us, and I know that however this day ends, it will not end with the United Earth Fleet failing to meet that darkness head-on, with everything we have, for as long as we are able. Across the fleet, in cramped bridges and cockpits scattered through the dark, tired, frightened crews, heard those words, and felt something steady settle over them despite the impossible odds ahead. The particular calm that comes not from believing you will win, but from deciding, together, that you will not fail to try. The battle that followed would be remembered, in the years afterward, as the darkest single day in Earth's short history among the stars. Darker, in its way, than even the worst days of the Vanguard War. Because this time, Earth's people watched it unfold in real time, on every screen, unable to look away from a fight that seemed, from its very first hour, to be a battle Earth could not win. Reyes's own flagship, the UEF Unity, took the front line of the defense, positioned to meet the Dominion's advance at the outer edge of Earth's orbital defenses, buying time for evacuation efforts already underway in the cities most likely to face bombardment if the fleet failed to hold. Around him, Earth's remaining 42 ships, one less than the number Threx had mocked in the Concorde chamber, though nobody had the heart, in that terrible hour, to note the significance of the missing vessel, spread into the defensive formation they had drilled 100 times in simulation, and never once believed they would need to fly in earnest. The Dominion fleet, when it finally came within engagement range, numbered over 300 ships, a wall of dark hulls that stretched across Reyes's tactical display like a physical embodiment of every mocking word Threx had ever spoken in that round silver chamber above a peaceful world. "All ships, hold formation," Reyes ordered, watching that overwhelming force approach with a calm he did not entirely feel. "We are not trying to win this battle today. We are trying to survive it long enough for something we cannot yet see to arrive." He did not know, as he gave that order, whether anything was truly coming to arrive at all. He only knew that somewhere out past Mars, 4 exhausted people were fighting a battle of their own, against a clock that had run out far sooner than anyone had planned for, and that the only thing left for him to do, in the face of overwhelming odds, was buy them every second he possibly could. The first Dominion volleys struck Earth's defensive line within minutes, and the long, terrible battle for humanity's survival began in earnest. Aboard the UEF Unity, a young weapons officer named Ensign Kofi Mensah, barely 2 years out of training and flying his first real combat engagement, found his hands shaking so badly over his console that he had to grip the edge of it for a long moment before he trusted himself to fire. Beside him, a veteran gunner 3 times his age reached over without a word and steadied his hands with her own, guiding his first shot true before releasing him to find his own rhythm. There was no time for reassurance beyond that single, silent gesture, but it was enough. By the battle's second hour, Mensah had become one of the Unity's most precise gunners, some part of him having decided, in the chaos of that first terrifying volley, that fear was a luxury the people counting on him could not afford him keeping. Similar small, unrecorded moments of courage played out across every one of Earth's 42 remaining ships that day. Moments that would never make it into any official history of the battle. Crews finding, in the space of a single desperate afternoon, reserves of steadiness they had not known they possessed, not because they were fearless, but because the alternative to finding that steadiness was watching the world they loved burn without having tried everything they had to save it. Deep within the asteroid, unaware yet of the battle raging above Earth, but keenly aware that time had become their only true enemy, Tobias Klein worked through the final, critical stage of Aegis Prime's reactor calibration, with a focus that had not wavered in over 20 hours of continuous effort. "I need everyone to listen to me carefully," he said, without looking up from the open access panel where he had spent the last hour making adjustments too delicate and too dangerous to explain in any detail that would not simply frighten the people around him. "We are one step away from a full, stable activation. One step. But that step requires someone to manually align the primary containment field from inside the reactor chamber itself, while the core is actively powering up, because the automated alignment systems were among the components removed 80 years ago and never replaced." "How dangerous is manual alignment?" Belena asked, though something in Tobias's careful, measured tone had already told her the answer would not be one she wanted to hear. "The chamber will flood with radiation levels that are survivable for approximately 90 seconds. With proper shielding," Tobias said. "Enough time to make the manual adjustment, provided whoever goes in knows exactly what they're doing and does not hesitate, even for a moment, once they're inside." "I'll do it," Marcus said immediately, struggling to sit up despite his bandaged shoulder. "You will not," Tobias said, with a gentleness that did nothing to soften the absolute firmness of his refusal. "You've lost a significant amount of blood in the last few hours, son, and your reaction time is nowhere close to what this job requires. I mean that with the greatest respect for your courage, which I do not doubt for 1 second. Then I will, Elena said. With respect, Captain. You don't know this reactor system well enough, Tobias said. I've spent 20 hours inside these schematics. I know exactly where every connection needs to align, exactly how much pressure each seal can tolerate, exactly what 90 seconds looks like when you're racing against a clock that doesn't care how much you want to succeed. I am, without false modesty, the only person on this ship qualified to do this job in the time we have left to do it. Dr. Osei, who had gone very quiet during this exchange, finally spoke, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone turn to look at her. Tobias, she said, radiation exposure at those levels, even for 90 seconds. I know what it means, Doc, Tobias said, and for the first time since Elena had met him, some of the steady, practical calm slipped from his broad, tired face, replaced by something more naked and more human. I've known what it might mean since we first found this ship. I want to be honest with all of you, because I think you've all earned that honesty, several times over, in the last week. I don't want to do this. I have a wife back on Earth, and 2 grown children, and I would very much like to see all of them again. But I have also spent 30 years of my life fixing things that other people had given up on, and I did not come out to this asteroid field hoping I'd never have to pay a price for what we might find here. I came because I believed, the same as the rest of you, that some things are worth paying a price for. The bridge was very quiet. There has to be another way, Marcus said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. If there was, I promise you, I would already be doing it that way, Tobias said. But the Dominion fleet is coming, and I suspect, given everything we've seen today, that it's coming faster and in greater numbers than any of us want to imagine. We do not have time to look for another way. We only have time to do the only way we've got. He looked at each of them in turn, Elena, Marcus, Dr. Osei, with the steady, unhurried attention of a man saying goodbye, without wanting to make it sound like one. I need each of you to promise me something, he said. When this is done, and it will be done, one way or another, I need you to fly this ship to Earth and use her exactly the way Adewezi Osi intended. Not for vengeance, not for conquest, only to protect the people who don't have any other way left to protect themselves. Can you promise me that? We promise, Elena said, her voice barely steady. Dr. Osei stepped forward then, her hands trembling as she reached out to grip Tobias's gloved hand in both of her own. My grandmother spent 40 years of silence carrying the weight of what she built, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she made no effort to hide. I do not think she ever forgave herself for the people this project cost, even the ones who survived it, even her own family, who she kept at arm's length for the rest of her life, because she could not find a way to explain the grief she carried. I do not want that same silence for you, Tobias Klein. I want your wife and your children to know exactly what you did here, and exactly why, and I promise you, on whatever is left of my grandmother's legacy, that they will. Tobias looked at her for a long moment, and something in his broad, tired face eased, just slightly, at her words. Thank you, Doc, he said quietly. That means more than I probably have time left to tell you properly. Then don't waste the time you have on speeches, Dr. Osei said, though her voice broke on the last word. Go do what you came here to do. Tobias only nodded once at that, filing the promise away someplace steady, because he had learned, over 30 years of difficult, necessary work, that dwelling too long on a kindness rarely made the hard parts of a job any easier. Marcus, watching him, found himself thinking of every goodbye his family had never gotten the chance to properly say to Daniel Cross, and made a silent, private promise that Tobias Klein would not be remembered the way his own father had so nearly been forgotten, by a galaxy too busy mocking Earth's grief to properly honor it. Good, Tobias said, and allowed himself, for just a moment, something that might have been a smile. Then let's get to work. I don't much fancy spending my last 90 seconds of usefulness standing around talking. What followed was among the hardest things Elena Cross would ever watch in her life. Tobias Klein, 60 years old, moving into the reactor chamber with the same steady, unhurried competence he had brought to every task since the mission began, sealing the chamber door behind him with his own hands so that no one else could follow, and beginning the final, critical alignment, exactly as the reactor core began, for the first time in 80 years, to power toward full activation. Through the chamber's small observation window, Elena watched her friend work with a focus that never once wavered, even as the radiation warnings on the monitoring station beside her climbed toward levels she did not want to look at directly, counting down the 90 seconds Tobias had promised them in numbers that felt, in that moment, both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. At 87 seconds, the final alignment locked into place, and the reactor core, dormant for 8 decades, blazed to sudden, brilliant life. Aegis Prime awoke. The change swept through the ancient ship in a wave that Elena felt as much as saw, lights blazing on in corridors that had known only darkness and emergency backup power for 80 years, systems humming to life one after another, in a cascading symphony of power and purpose. The great ship's ancient AI core, dormant alongside everything else, stirring at last from 8 decades of patient, waiting sleep. A voice, not quite human, though built, Elena understood instinctively, from the careful recorded patterns of the woman who had commanded this ship 80 years before, spoke through every speaker on the bridge, calm and clear, and utterly unlike anything any of them had expected to hear. Aegis Prime primary systems online, the voice said. Reactor stable, all defensive and propulsion systems at full readiness. Welcome aboard, whoever you are. Chief Engineer Adazi Ose recorded this activation greeting 80 years ago, in the hope that if this moment ever came, it would find her ship in capable hands. I believe, based on the activation sequence just completed, that it has. Please state your destination. For a long, stunned moment, nobody on the bridge could speak at all. It was Dr. Ose who finally found her voice, tears running freely down her face, as she looked toward the sealed reactor chamber, where Tobias Klein had given everything he had to bring this moment into being. Earth, she said, her voice thick but clear. Take us to Earth, as fast as you possibly can. Course laid in, the ship's voice replied. Estimated arrival time, factoring maximum safe acceleration, 6 hours. Slowly, majestically, after 80 years of silence and secrecy, Aegis Prime began to rise from the ancient cavern that had sheltered her, breaking free of the asteroid that had hidden her from the galaxy's notice for 8 long decades, and turned her ancient, awakened bow toward a small blue world that did not yet know how close her final hour truly was. 6 hours. Elena did the grim math even as relief and grief warred inside her chest in equal measure. 6 hours was an eternity to a world already under Dominion attack, and no time at all compared to the 80 years this ship had already waited. She did not know, as Aegis Prime turned toward Earth and began the long 6-hour journey home, that above the small blue world she had grown up on, General Reyes and the remains of Earth's fleet were, at that very moment, fighting a battle they had already, quietly, in their own hearts, begun to accept they might not survive. Somewhere in that gathering darkness, 6 hours felt like it might be 5 hours and 59 minutes too long. 5 hours into the battle for Earth, General Reyes stood on the shattered bridge of the UEF Unity, one arm cradled against his chest where a falling support beam had broken it during the ship's third major hit, and looked at a tactical display that told him, in the cold, unambiguous language of numbers, that Earth's fleet had perhaps 20 minutes left before it ceased to exist as a fighting force at all. Of the 42 ships that had formed Earth's defensive line at the battle's start, 11 remained combat-capable. The rest drifted, broken and burning, scattered across a battlefield that stretched from the orbit of Mars nearly to Earth's own moon, a graveyard of every ship humanity had built in its short, hopeful decades among the stars. Sir, his tactical officer said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone reporting news too terrible to deliver with any other tone. Dominion forward elements are entering Earth's outer atmosphere defense perimeter. If we can't stop them in the next few minutes, they'll be in bombardment range of the surface. Reyes looked at the display a moment longer, at the thinning, desperate line of Earth's remaining ships, and made the only decision left available to a commander who had run out of every other option. All remaining ships, converge on my position, he ordered. We form one last line, here, between the Dominion fleet and Earth's surface. We do not retreat. We do not break formation. If this is the day Earth falls, it will not fall, because the United Earth Fleet stopped fighting. Down on the surface of the world he had sworn to protect, in cities across every continent, people who had spent the last week and a half watching this battle unfold on every screen available to them, now watched what all of them, without needing to be told, understood to be the final act. In Lagos, in Manila, in Sao Paulo, in 1,000 other cities whose names would forever after be marked by where their people had been on this particular day, families gathered in shelters that had been reopened just days before, watching broadcasts that no censor now bothered to soften, because there seemed, in that darkest hour, no longer any point in pretending the truth was anything other than what it plainly was. In one such shelter, in the same city where Grace Okonkwo had told her granddaughter an old story about a sleeping ship some days before, the old woman held the little girl close, watching the same grim broadcast as everyone else, and found herself, without quite meaning to, repeating the words she had spoken days earlier, like something between a promise and a prayer. "The darkest moment is not always the last one," she murmured, more to herself now than to the child in her arms. "It is not always the last one." Above them, in the cold dark of space, Reyes watched his 11 remaining ships form their final, desperate line, and prepared to give the order that would send every one of them into a fight none of them expected to survive. He thought, in that last quiet moment before giving the order, of every officer he had trained over 3 decades of service, of Daniel Cross, whose ship had never come home from a border skirmish that the Dominion had barely bothered to acknowledge, of Elena and Marcus, wherever they were now, out past Mars, chasing a hope he had authorized against his own better judgment. He thought of the 30 days Threx had offered in that round silver chamber, and of how little those 30 days had actually meant, in the end, to an empire that broke its own deadlines whenever convenient. And he thought, with a clarity that surprised him even in that desperate moment, that he did not regret a single choice that had led him here. Not the decision to trust an old historian's family secret, not the decision to buy time with nothing but stubborn defiance, not even the decision, years before, to keep fighting a war that the numbers had always said Earth could not win. Some choices he had learned across 3 decades of service were not about the odds at all. They were about who you intended to be when the odds finally came due. He keyed his comm one final time, addressing not his fleet now but the whole of Earth, every screen still broadcasting this final, desperate stand. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes," he said, his voice steady despite the broken arm cradled against his chest, "I want every person listening to know that the United Earth Fleet met this day standing, not kneeling. Whatever comes next, remember that we chose to stand." It was at that moment, with the Dominion's forward elements bearing down on Earth's last line of defense, with 11 ships preparing to make a stand that could, at absolute best, buy the planet below a few more precious minutes of life, that Reyes's tactical officer looked up from her station, with an expression Reyes had not seen on anyone's face in the entire 5 hours of this terrible battle. "Sir," she said, her voice suddenly, impossibly, carrying something that sounded almost like hope, "I'm reading a massive contact, inbound from the outer system. Sir, it's not on any registry I have. It's not Dominion. It's not one of ours. It's not anything." Reyes felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 5 long hours of watching his fleet die around him, a single fragile spark of hope, so faint he was almost afraid to acknowledge it. "Show me," he said. The image that resolved on the Unity's damaged main display, even through the static of a ship that had taken far more damage than any vessel should survive, showed a shape emerging from the outer dark that dwarfed every other object on the tactical screen, a vessel of a scale that made the largest Dominion battleship look, by comparison, like little more than a shuttlecraft, its hull dark and ancient, and utterly, impossibly real. "That's," Reyes's voice failed him for a moment, 80 years of careful secrecy and quiet, desperate hope colliding all at once in his chest. "That's Aegis Prime." Across the shattered remains of Earth's fleet, across the bridges of 11 ships preparing to make a final, hopeless stand, the same message spread in an instant, carried on every open channel, and for the first time in 5 hours of watching their world come apart, exhausted crews who had already, quietly, made their peace with dying that day, looked up from their stations in stunned, disbelieving hope. The myth their grandparents had told them about, the bedtime story every child on Earth had grown up hearing, and every adult had grown up doubting, was real, and she was here, and she had arrived not a moment too soon. Aegis Prime entered Earth's orbit in a manner that could only be described, by everyone who witnessed it, as an arrival that seemed to bend the very fabric of the moment around itself. She came in slow and deliberate, and utterly without hesitation, her ancient hull catching the light of Earth's sun in a way that made her look, for one breathless instant, less like a machine than like something out of legend finally made flesh, a mountain given purpose, a myth given motion, arriving in the one moment in 80 years when the world she had been built to protect needed her most. On the bridge, Elena stood beside Dr. Ose, watching the small blue curve of Earth grow steadily larger on the viewport, 6 hours of desperate travel, finally, agonizingly, reaching its end. "Report from Earth's fleet," the ship's AI voice reported, calm and steady even now. 11 vessels remain combat-capable, positioned in defensive formation between the Dominion advance force and Earth's surface. Dominion forward elements are 7 minutes from bombardment range. "Get us between them," Elena said. "Now." Aegis Prime moved with a grace that belied her impossible size, sliding into position directly between the battered remnant of Earth's fleet and the advancing wall of Dominion warships with a precision that made Marcus, watching from the co-pilot station he had insisted on manning, despite his bandaged shoulder, let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Aboard the Dominion flagship, at the head of the invasion force that had, until this exact moment, believed itself facing nothing more than the last, desperate gasps of a doomed and outmatched world, Overlord Threx watched the same impossible sight unfold on his own tactical display, and felt, for the first time and longer than he cared to remember, something that might have been called fear. "Identify that vessel," he snapped at his tactical officer, his usual cold, amused calm entirely absent from his voice. "Unable to identify, Overlord," the officer replied, and Threx could hear, even through the careful discipline of Dominion military bearing, the same disbelief that had spread through Earth's fleet minutes before, now working its way through his own. "Scans show technology signatures inconsistent with anything in our records. Power readings are, Overlord. The readings suggest this single vessel may exceed the combined output of our entire invasion fleet." Threx stared at the image on his display, a ship larger than anything the Dominion itself had ever built, arriving from a direction and a world his own intelligence networks had assured him, for 15 years, possessed nothing beyond 43 small, outdated warships, and a great deal of stubborn, foolish pride. "Hail them," he said finally, his voice tight with an emotion he did not care to examine too closely. The channel opened, and Elena, standing at the center of Aegis Prime's ancient bridge, found herself, for one strange moment, face to face with the alien overlord, whose casual cruelty had cost 400 lives at Kepler's landing, and set in motion everything that had followed since. "This is Overlord Threx of the Corvette Dominion," the alien said, his cold yellow eyes fixed on the display before him, studying Elena, with an intensity that had entirely replaced the amused, dismissive contempt he had shown General Reyes, in that round silver chamber weeks before. "You are operating a vessel of unknown origin in a combat zone. Identify yourself, and explain the meaning of this technology." Elena thought for a moment, of Kepler's landing, of the old woman with her single photograph, of 400 people who had died because Threx believed Earth too small and too weak to matter. She thought of her father, and of Tobias Klein, sealed forever now inside the reactor chamber he had given his life to stabilize. She thought of Adaeze Ose's recorded voice, 80 years old, insisting that this ship existed not for vengeance, but only for protection. "My name is Elena Cross," she said, "Captain, United Earth Fleet. This is Aegis Prime. She was built 80 years ago, during a war you have never heard of, by people who believed their world might not survive it. She has waited, hidden, ever since, for a day when Earth would need her again." She paused, and let her next words carry every ounce of the quiet, hard-won resolve that had carried her from a burning colony to this exact moment. You laughed at Earth's ships, Overlord. You called our fleet a child who wandered into a room full of grown men. I am here to tell you that the child has grown, and she remembers exactly who laughed at her." For a long moment, Threx said nothing at all, his cold yellow eyes fixed on the display, on the impossible scale of the vessel bearing down on his invasion fleet, on the calm, unshakable certainty in the voice of a human captain he had, until this exact moment, never once considered worth taking seriously. "Withdraw your forces from Earth's system," Elena said, into that heavy silence, "or Aegis Prime will remove them by force. This is the only warning you will receive." Threx did not withdraw. Elena had not truly expected him to. Pride of the kind that had let him mock a grieving world in front of the entire Concord did not bend easily, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that it should. Instead, the Dominion Overlord did exactly what Elena had privately feared he might. He ordered his entire invasion fleet, over 300 ships strong, to converge on the single impossible vessel that had appeared, without warning, to threaten everything he had built his reputation on conquering. "All forward batteries engage," Threx ordered, his voice tight with a fury that had entirely replaced his earlier, careful calculation. "I do not care what that ship is. I will not be humbled by a species I have spent 15 years calling children." The battle that followed would be remembered, in every history written afterward, as the moment the galaxy's understanding of Earth changed forever. Aegis Prime met the full weight of the Dominion's invasion fleet, with weapons and shields built from technology that had been, 80 years before, decades ahead of anything the wider galaxy possessed, and 8 decades of careful, patient maintenance, and Tobias Klein's desperate final sacrifice had done nothing to diminish that gap. Where the Dominion's warships fired weapons that would have crippled or destroyed any of Earth's small remaining cruisers, Aegis Prime's ancient shields absorbed the impacts with barely a shudder felt on her bridge. Where Earth's 43 ships had struggled to make any meaningful impact against even a handful of Dominion vessels, Aegis Prime's own weapons, systems her long-dead builders had designed specifically to end a war against a foe more terrible than even the Corvette Dominion, tore through the Dominion formation with a devastating, methodical precision that left no doubt, to anyone watching from either side, about which vessel in that battle truly held the advantage. "Report," Elena called out, watching the tactical display with a fierce, focused calm that had settled over her the moment the first shots were exchanged. "Dominion fleet formation is breaking," came the reply from the station Priya had taken up, having transferred over from the Meridian in the last hour before Aegis Prime's departure from the asteroid belt. "They're taking losses faster than they can adjust, Captain. I'm reading panic in their communications. Actual panic, not just tactical repositioning." Marcus, watching the battle unfold from his station beside Elena, found himself thinking of every simulation he had ever run against Dominion-class vessels, exercises that had always ended, no matter how skilled the pilot, in simulated defeat, because no one had ever built a simulation that accounted for a ship like Aegis Prime existing at all. There was something almost dizzying about watching the impossible math of the battle resolve itself in Earth's favor. 300 Dominion warships scattering before a single vessel, the way a school of fish scatters before a shark, far larger than anything they had ever imagined swimming in their waters. "I keep waiting for this to feel like winning," he said quietly, mostly to himself. Elena glanced at him, understanding immediately what he meant. "It will," she said. "Eventually. Right now, it just feels like surviving something that should have killed us. Give it time. The winning feeling comes later, usually after you've had a chance to actually believe it happened." He nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the tactical display, on the retreating shapes of Dominion warships that, less than an hour before, had seemed like the certain end of everything he loved. Somewhere in that scattering formation, Elena knew, Threx was watching his carefully built reputation as an unstoppable conqueror come apart in real time, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she took no particular pleasure in it. There was relief in the battle's turning, and grief for everything it had already cost, but the satisfaction she might once have imagined feeling toward a defeated enemy simply was not there. Perhaps, she thought, that absence was its own kind of answer to the question Adeze Ose's recording had asked of her, 80 years across the silence. whether this ship's power would be used to conquer or only to protect. She found she already knew which answer she preferred to give. On the shattered bridge of the UEF Unity, General Reyes watched the same battle unfold with an expression that mixed disbelief, exhaustion, and a fierce, rising pride that pushed back, at last, against 5 hours of watching his fleet die around him. "Sir," his tactical officer said, her voice thick with emotion she no longer bothered to hide. "Dominion forces are in full retreat along their eastern flank. Aegis Prime is, sir. She's not just holding them off. She's winning. She's actually winning." "Then let's help her finish the job," Reyes said, and felt something like his old fire return to his voice as he turned to address what remained of Earth's fleet. "All ships, target the Dominion's exposed flanks. We're not carrying this fight alone anymore. Let's make sure Threx remembers exactly who stood beside Aegis Prime on the day his invasion failed." Earth's remaining 11 ships, battered but unbroken, threw themselves back into the fight with a renewed ferocity that surprised even their own exhausted crews, striking at the disorganized edges of a Dominion formation that had, in the space of less than 20 minutes, gone from an unstoppable invasion force to a fleet fighting desperately for its own survival. Aboard Aegis Prime, Elena watched the battle's tide complete its turn with a grim, hard-won satisfaction that carried no real joy in it, only the exhausted relief of someone who had spent every hour of the last 8 days believing this moment might never actually arrive. "Overlord Threx is hailing us again," the ship's AI reported. "Put him through," Elena said. Threx's face appeared on the display once more, and this time, the cold, amused contempt that had marked every previous exchange was entirely gone, replaced by something far more complicated. Fury, still, but tempered now by a fear he no longer had the composure to fully hide. "You have made your point, Captain Cross," he said, each word clearly costing him something. "The Dominion is prepared to discuss terms of withdrawal." Elena looked at the alien overlord for a long moment, thinking again of Kepler's landing, of 400 people who would never receive the chance to hear this concession, of Tobias Klein, sealed forever inside the reactor chamber he had given his life to bring online. "Withdraw every ship from Earth's system," she said finally. "Now, not after negotiation, not after terms. Every ship immediately, or Aegis Prime continues this engagement until there is nothing left of your fleet to negotiate with at all." For one long, terrible moment, she thought Threx might refuse, might let his pride overrule what remained of his tactical judgment. Then, slowly, the Dominion overlord's cold yellow eyes dropped, just slightly, in the closest thing to acknowledgement of defeat that his proud, ancient people would likely ever show a species they had spent 15 years calling children. "Order the fleet to withdraw," he said, to someone off-screen, his voice tight with a bitterness that would clearly take far longer than this single moment to fade. "All ships, immediate withdrawal from Earth's system." The Dominion fleet withdrew from Earth's system over the following hour, 300 ships that had arrived with the confident intention of conquest, departing instead in a ragged, humbled retreat that every remaining member of Earth's fleet watched with an exhaustion too deep, in that first hour, to fully process as victory. Across Earth, in cities that had spent the last 5 hours believing they were watching their own final day unfold, the news spread with a speed that seemed to outrun even the light of the retreating Dominion ships themselves. In shelters and city squares, and small apartments overlooking harbors from Lagos to Manila to Sao Paulo, people who had held their breath through the darkest hour their young species had ever faced among the stars, began, cautiously, and then with growing, disbelieving joy, to breathe again. In one such shelter, Grace Okonkwo held her granddaughter close and watched the broadcast confirm what she had told the child only days before, that the darkest moment is not always the last one, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, weeping not from grief, but from a relief so enormous it felt almost like its own kind of pain. Aboard Aegis Prime, in the hours immediately following the Dominion's retreat, the crew that had brought this impossible ship home found themselves caught in the strange, disorienting space between triumph and grief that follows any battle bought at real and terrible cost. General Reyes, his broken arm finally receiving proper medical attention aboard his own battered flagship, requested and received permission to come aboard Aegis Prime personally, arriving within hours of the Dominion's withdrawal to see, with his own eyes, the ship that had, until 8 days before, existed for him only as a desperate, unproven hope, buried in an old woman's family secret. "Captain Cross," he said, when Elena met him at the same modest crew airlock through which the small team had first entered this ship 8 days before. "I don't believe I have adequate words for what you and your team accomplished. I'm not certain the language exists yet to properly describe it." "We didn't do it alone, sir," Elena said, and something in her voice made Reyes look at her more closely. "We lost someone. Tobias Klein. He's still aboard, sir, in the reactor chamber. He sealed himself in to complete a manual alignment that saved this entire ship, and there wasn't time, in the end, to—" She could not quite finish the sentence, and Reyes, who had spent over 2 decades learning exactly how to carry the weight of losses that came wrapped in victory, simply nodded, understanding, without needing further explanation. "Then we'll bring him home properly," he said quietly. "Every one of them, whatever it takes." They recovered Tobias Klein's body from the reactor chamber 3 days later, once radiation levels within had finally dropped to safe levels, and gave him, in the days that followed, a memorial service that drew mourners from every corner of Earth. Not only his wife and 2 grown children, who stood at the front of a gathering held in the same Fleet Command building where the whole impossible mission had first begun, but thousands of ordinary people who had never known his name before. The story of Aegis Prime's arrival became public, and who came anyway, because some sacrifices demand to be witnessed even by strangers. He told me in his final hour that he had a wife and 2 children back on Earth, and that he would very much like to see them again, Elena said, standing before that gathering with a composure she had to work hard to maintain. He also told me that he had spent 30 years of his life fixing things other people had given up on, and that he had not come to that asteroid field hoping he would never have to pay a price for what we might find there. I think about those 2 things together, often, since we lost him. I think he understood something that I am still learning to understand myself, that loving your life, and being willing to give it for something larger than yourself, are not opposites. Sometimes they are the very same courage, wearing 2 different faces. Dr. Amara Osei spoke next, her voice steadier than it had been at any point during the 8 days of their impossible journey, though the grief in it was unmistakable. "My grandmother built this ship believing that peace is fragile and terribly easy to break," she said. "She hid it away, not out of shame, but out of hope. Hope that humanity would never again need what she and her generation had been forced to build. I used to think her choice to hide Aegis Prime was the bravest thing anyone in my family ever did. I know now that I was only half right. Tobias Klein's choice, 8 days ago, to finish what my grandmother started, knowing exactly what it might cost him, was every bit as brave, and I do not believe Earth would be standing here today, safe and whole, without both of those choices, made 80 years apart, by 2 people who never had the chance to meet each other." Tobias's wife, a quiet, steady woman named Miriam who had spent 31 years married to a man who fixed things other people gave up on, spoke last, her voice remarkably composed given the weight of what she had to say. "Tobias used to tell me that the measure of a good engineer wasn't whether they could build something perfect the first time," she said. "It was whether they could look at something broken, something everyone else had already written off, and see a way to make it whole again, even if the fix cost them something of their own. He spent his whole life believing that some things were worth the cost of fixing them properly. I am so proud, and so heartbroken, that this ship turned out to be one of those things." Her voice caught, just once, before she continued. "He would want me to tell all of you that he did not consider his life wasted in that reactor chamber. He considered it well spent. I have decided, standing here today, that I agree with him, even though some days that agreement costs me more than I know how to say." Their 2 grown children, a son who had followed his father into engineering, and a daughter who worked as a teacher in the same rebuilt coastal region where Tobias had grown up, stood on either side of their mother throughout the service, neither of them speaking, both of them holding hands with a quiet, steady grip that needed no words to explain what it meant. Elena found herself, in the days after the memorial, unable to stop thinking of Miriam Klein's composed, grief-worn face. and of the particular kind of courage it must take to stand before thousands of strangers and speak with pride about a loss that would clearly ache for the rest of her life. She thought there might be no braver thing in the whole of this impossible story than that. A woman choosing, in the middle of her own private devastation, to make sure the world understood exactly what her husband's sacrifice had actually meant. In the weeks that followed Tobias Klein's memorial, the interstellar Concorde reconvened in the same round silver chamber where General Reyes had once stood alone, mocked by an overlord who believed Earth too small to matter. This time, when Reyes took his place at Earth's small podium, no laughter moved through the surrounding rings of delegates. Overlord Threx, present at the session under terms of a formal ceasefire that the Corvette Dominion had signed within a week of its fleet's humiliating retreat, said very little throughout the proceedings, his cold yellow eyes fixed most often on the delegation from Earth, with an expression that had, in the space of a single battle, transformed entirely from contempt into something far more careful. Earth has demonstrated capabilities this Concorde did not previously account for, said the presiding delegate, a being from a world Elena still could not properly pronounce the name of, addressing the full chamber in the careful, formal language of interstellar diplomacy. This body extends formal recognition of Earth's sovereign status and invites Earth's government to full participation in all future Concorde proceedings, no longer as observer, but as an equal member with standing rights. It was not vengeance, and it was not conquest, Elena, watching a recording of the session later from the observation deck of Aegis Prime, thought of Adeze Ose's recorded voice, insisting 80 years before that the ship existed only for protection, never for the expansion of power for its own sake, and felt a quiet, complicated pride that Earth's answer to 80 years of fear and secrecy had arrived, in the end, exactly as its long-dead builder had hoped it would, not as a weapon turned against a defeated enemy, but as a shield that had done its only job, and then simply continued standing watch. On a quiet evening several weeks after the battle that had, in the space of a single terrible and miraculous day, changed Earth's place in the galaxy forever, Elena Cross stood once more on the observation deck of the Fleet Command Station, looking down at the blue and white curve of the world she had nearly lost, exactly as she had stood 8 days before everything changed, waiting for a mission she had not been certain would succeed. Marcus found her there, his shoulder healing well under the careful attention of the fleet's medical staff, though the scar it would leave behind would be, Elena suspected, one he wore with a certain quiet pride for the rest of his life. "Dr. Ose asked me to give you this," he said, holding out a small, worn photograph, the same one, Elena realized with a small shock, that had belonged to the elderly survivor of Kepler's landing, the woman who had carried nothing else off that dying colony, except a single picture and the clothes on her back. "Why does she have this?" "She tracked the woman down after the battle," Marcus said. "Wanted to make sure she was all right. Turns out she wanted Dr. Ose to have a copy, once she heard the whole story. What really happened out at Site 12, what it cost to bring Aegis Prime home." He turned the photograph over, and on the back, in careful, old-fashioned handwriting, were words that made Elena's throat tighten. "For everyone who never got the chance to see this day. Thank you for making sure the rest of us did." They stood together a while in silence, looking down at Earth, thinking of their father, who had died defending a border colony from an enemy the whole galaxy had once believed Earth too weak to ever properly answer, and of Tobias Klein, who had given his own life, 80 years after Adeze Ose gave hers to a project she never lived to see completed, to make certain that answer finally, truly arrived. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Marcus asked quietly, the same question, in a different form, that he had asked her once before, on this same observation deck, in the darkest days before any of this had begun. Elena thought about it seriously, the way she always tried to answer Marcus's hardest questions. "I think Dad spent his whole career believing Earth deserved better than what the galaxy expected of us," she said finally. "I think he'd be proud that we finally proved him right. And I think," she added, more quietly, "that he'd tell us not to let this be the end of proving it. Earth has a seat at that Concorde table now, for the first time since we joined the wider galaxy. What we do with it, that's still a story that hasn't finished being written." Far below them, Aegis Prime hung in a slow, steady orbit around the world she had been built, 80 years before. To protect. No longer hidden. No longer a myth or a bedtime story told to frighten children into hopeful sleep, but a quiet, constant presence in Earth's sky that every person on the planet below could look up and see for themselves. A reminder made visible at last of exactly how much courage and sacrifice and patient, hidden hope it had taken to bring her home. Dr. Osei had taken up quarters aboard the great ship in the weeks since the battle, appointed by a grateful council of nations to serve as its chief historian and steward, the keeper, at last and by her own choice, of the legacy her grandmother had carried alone and in silence for so many decades. She had told Elena, in a quiet moment shortly after the memorial service, that she intended to spend whatever years she had left, making certain Aegis Prime's true story was never again allowed to fade into rumor and myth, told carefully enough, and honestly enough, that no future generation would ever again have to rediscover, by desperate accident, what this one had only barely uncovered in time. She had already begun the work, in fact, spending her days moving through the ship's vast corridors with a recording device and an archivist's patient thoroughness, cataloging every workstation, every faded photograph, every small human detail her grandmother's generation had left behind, determined that this time, the true history of Aegis Prime would belong to everyone, not be buried again in a single family's carefully guarded silence. She had invited Talia Reyes Nkemelu, the young mother Marcus had carried to safety from Kepler's Landing, to record her own account of that day for the growing archive, alongside Grace Okonkwo's story of the old bedtime tale that had turned out, against every reasonable expectation, to be entirely true. History belongs to everyone who lived through it, Dr. Osei had told Elena, during one of their many quiet conversations in the weeks since the battle. Not only to the people who happened to have access to the archives. My grandmother believed secrecy was the safest way to protect what she had built. I have come to believe that shared memory, honestly kept, protects it better still. Elena had come to agree with her, though she suspected it would take the wider galaxy considerably longer to fully absorb what Earth's small mocked fleet had actually accomplished, first surviving an attack that was meant to break their spirit, and then answering it not with vengeance, but with a defense 80 years in the careful, grieving making. Overlord Threx, for his part, would spend the years that followed quietly rebuilding a reputation among his own people that had never fully recovered from the humiliation of his fleet's retreat, though he made no further attempts. In all the time Elena would go on to hear of him, to test Earth's resolve again. Some lessons, it seemed, only needed teaching once, provided the lesson landed hard enough the first time. They laughed at our ships, Elena said quietly, half to Marcus and half to the quiet evening air, remembering the sound of that dry, rattling laughter echoing through a round silver chamber weeks before, remembering Overlord Threx's cold, amused voice, calling Earth a child who had wandered into a room full of grown men. They thought Aegis Prime was nothing but a myth we told ourselves to feel less afraid. And then she entered orbit, Marcus finished quietly, looking up at the great, ancient shape hanging steady and unhurried against the darkening sky, a shield, 80 years in the making, awake now at last, and watching faithfully over the small, blue, and stubbornly hopeful world she had always been meant to protect. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. There was nothing left, in that quiet moment, that needed saying. Above them, Earth turned slowly on, exactly as it always had, and for the first time in longer than either of them could properly remember, neither Elena nor Marcus Cross felt even the smallest flicker of fear looking up at the sky.